G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Talkspace a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this pandemic seems to ruin just about everything, right? Travel plans, birthdays, weddings, you name it. I feel like our lives have been disrupted in every way possible, big and small. I mean, all those little ways that we used to celebrate and make memories seem like they're never coming back. Luckily though, my therapist is here to listen and help me see the bright spots, even on the bad days. I wholeheartedly recommend Talkspace for therapy. You can sign up online and start the therapy the same day as you sign up. You can text, video, or send voice messages to your licensed therapist, so it's incredibly convenient to have virtual sessions from the comfort of your home. And when I talk to my therapist about my goals in life, along with how to improve my relationships with my family, it felt great airing things out and really helped me with moving forward in a positive mind frame. Talkspace is a fraction of the cost of in-person therapy. Instead of waiting for an appointment, you can send unlimited messages to your therapist 24/7, and they'll engage with you daily, 5 days a week. They have thousands of licensed therapists with years of experience in over 40 specialties, including depression, anxiety, substance abuse, trauma, anger management, relationship issues, food and eating, and so much more. And, as a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off of your first month with Talkspace. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com or download the app. Make sure to use the code SCARED to get $100 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's SCARED and Talkspace.com. So, there are a couple of incidences leading up to the not-so-imaginary friend that I'll talk about first because I think they might be related. When my son was a baby, one of his first words was Guy. He would say Mama, Daddy, and Guy. He was seeing something that we couldn't see, and he called it Guy. For example, he would point to the corner of the room and say, Guy. Never scared, but sort of excited when he would point to him. Sometimes he would wave at him and giggle. Being who we are, we just assumed that he was seeing something spiritual. At the time, Guy never caused us any issues, and my son didn't seem afraid. Time went on, and as my son got older and could speak a little better, he told me that he wanted Guy to leave. And to be honest, he seemed a little bit uneasy. We were in my bedroom, and I was holding my son on my hip. My son pointed to the corner of the room to let me know that Guy was there. I said to Guy in a firm voice, feeling a little bit silly to be honest, Guy, it's time for you to leave our house. Please move on in peace, but you're not welcome here anymore. But before I could finish speaking, my son let out a deafening scream, buried his face in my shoulder and cried, Run, 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 Mummy, run. He was crying and terrified. Super startled too. I just embraced my son and I ran out of the room. I tried not to show my fear. I wanted to be brave for my son, but to be honest, it really rattled me. I don't know what he saw that day. I can only really imagine. His reaction was just so intense. I asked, but he just refused to talk about it. Whatever it was, though, it was real to him and extremely scary for both of us. It was from this point forward that my son had problems sleeping at night, scared of the dark, started walking in his sleep and just very jumpy. He never spoke of Guy again, but we did have other stuff sort of happen. We experienced lots of activity, I guess you could call it, in that house, like shadow figures, lights turning on, disembodied voices, items falling off of tables on their own, etc. One particular light, in fact, that would turn on randomly was in my son's closet. I never told anyone about the light, but one night my sister was babysitting my son, and she says to me nervously, "What's up with your child's closet? It's creepy in there, and I swear the light keeps turning on." Fast forward though, my son is 4 years old now and starts interacting with something that I can't see again. Some might say an imaginary friend. He would talk to him when he was playing alone and would stop talking when I entered the room. This went on for a couple of weeks, and whenever I would ask about his friend, he would sort of shy away from it. Didn't really want to talk about it. Eventually, my son told me that this friend was sad because his family was far away and that's why he was staying with us now. I asked if this friend had a name, and my son says, yeah, he's a kid and his name is Godmo. I was expecting to hear a common name like John or something. I thought to myself, well, that's a really strange name, and I sort of felt a little bit anxious about it, if I'm being honest. Realizing, though, that my son was ready to talk about his friend, I would ask him questions about Godmo during normal conversation. I never pressed him for too much information because I didn't want him to stop talking to me about it. My son tells me, though, that Godmo comes and goes through our mirrors. And man, do I get goosebumps just thinking about that. Mirrors? Like mirrors? According to my son, he enters our home through the mirror above my bed and exits through the bathroom mirror. That was really elaborate info for a 4-year-old, and now I'm starting to feel, well, quite uneasy about this Godmo. I started researching mirrors and spirits, and I quickly find out that maybe I should remove the mirror above my bed. Apparently, we are most vulnerable when we're sleeping, and a mirror could act as a doorway. Anyway, days go by and the activity in our home ramps up. One example, for instance, was that after putting my son to bed, I heard things being moved in his room, and it sounded a lot like someone digging around in a toy box. I get up and go back into his room thinking that my son was awake. I see that his bedroom light is on. I walk into the room ready to tell him to get back into bed, and he was completely sound asleep. Not only was he sound asleep too, but he was perfectly tucked in and not one blanket had been moved. It was clear to me that he had not been out of bed. And I know what I heard, and I have no clue how or why his light is on. The next morning, I asked my son if he turned his light on last night, knowing that he didn't, but I had to ask anyway. And he says to me, no, but Godmo turns on the lights because he doesn't like the dark. I asked him if Godmo scares him sometimes, and to my surprise he said yes, when he gets angry. Oh, and he does not like you, Mum. Angry? And he doesn't like me? At this point, I'm pretty much done with Godmo. Concerned for my baby, I spoke to my sister about everything, and she agreed that she didn't feel good about it either. It's creepy, right? I always trust my first instinct. So, could this Godmo be something sinister? Could it be posing as a little kid but actually be something else? Something dark and evil? All things considered, I didn't know for certain, but I felt concerned and I was worried about my 4-year-old. I mean, even the name Godmo alone was really weird to me. So I decided that it was time to do something. In the end, I decided upon a major spiritual cleanse in my home. I sage, white sage, randomly, but this time I was more thorough, more serious and focused. At the time, I thought that this was best to do this when my son wasn't at home. Although I am spiritual, open-minded, and believe in the paranormal, I don't push my beliefs and practices on my kids. So he was unaware of what I was doing. Lots of praying, sage, calling on angels for protection, candles, you name it. I also removed that mirror from my bedroom, and the activity settles. Approximately 3 weeks later, I think, my son comes to me very upset though, still unaware of the cleanse, and he tells me that he wants Godmo back. Please bring him back. I told him that Godmo returned to his family, not knowing how to explain these things that I don't even fully understand myself to a 4-year-old. But that for me confirmed that there was something very real and very strange going on. I mean, like I said, my 4-year-old wasn't there and I did all this stuff quietly and alone. So how he knew that Godmo was supposed to be gone at this stage, well, I can only put that down to the fact that whatever this thing was had actually been removed. When I would discuss this with close family, I felt like I needed to be cautious about saying Godmo out loud. His name makes me nervous, and I just didn't want Godmo to return. My inner voice is telling me not to repeat his name. I can't explain why, but it's just how I feel, and even now, I don't like sharing it. Years later, though, in a different home, my son, 7 years old at the time, started seeing a dark shadow in the hallway where I had hung the old bedroom mirror in our house. And it was at that point that I trashed that mirror. I don't know if the shadow was connected to his previous experience, but either way, I decided to get rid of that mirror. We still have activity, but nothing that really concerns me anymore. Nothing too heavy. Overall, we have more positive experiences than negative ones, to be honest. But, yeah, Godmo, that's an experience that I'll never forget. So this is one of those rare times where I was so confused as a kid that it stuck with me even 13 years later. This is a bit of a long one, but I would love to hear your thoughts about it, so stick with me. So this was when I was like 8 or 9 years old in my old house, in a building with like 20-something apartments. Now, this building was built in our land, and we got houses there, and about half of all the apartments were occupied by our relatives, and the other half by friends and people that we knew. In our small street, there was just 2 buildings and some private houses owned by us, so we pretty much knew everybody. And this was set up that way so that all of us would be very familiar with everyone living around us. Now, one day when my parents and little sister went out, I wanted to stay and watch cartoons by myself, and my parents, weirdly enough, allowed for me for the first time to stay alone. My grandma was next door, and they would usually call her to check on me, but not this time. So I watched some of my favorite shows, and when they were done, or maybe the electricity went off, I don't remember exactly. I remember that I was just alone without doing anything, and the only thing keeping me company was my sister's doll that my mum had put on the counter. But I distinctly remember that when I looked over, the doll seemed like it was looking at me, almost like everywhere I moved. This doll was given to my sister a couple of days ago by my little cousin that owned it before her, and they have 1 year difference. And I absolutely hated this doll, while my sister loved it so much and was completely obsessed with it. I was absolutely not allowed to touch it, or she would cry and my mum and dad would yell at me. She never let it go. Even leaving the doll at home was weird, but I mean, whatever, right? But I just got this feeling of dread the more and more I looked at it. So I decided that this was my chance to get rid of it. I grabbed it, hit it, stomped it, smashed it on the wall, and then decided that I was going to throw it off the balcony. It was raining heavily that day, so we had our large collapsible tarp fully extended. Me being a little kid, I was shorter than the balcony wall, so I pushed the doll to fall, and after that I left happily. After a while, my family returned home, and I definitely thought that I was going to get in trouble because my sister would immediately want the doll that she was forced to leave at home, but in the end, nothing came of it. She didn't ask for it, my parents didn't seem to notice that it was gone. It was almost like it never existed, and to be honest, I was okay with that. In fact, I was kind of happy about that. Hours later, I was watching cartoons again with my sister, and we were all in the living room. Dad was sleeping on the couch, Mum was washing the dishes, and it was about 9 p.m. when the doorbell rang, and I yelled, "Mum, the door," and she answered, "Open it then." Now, this was really weird because she had many times told me and my sister to never open the door without a grown-up present under no circumstances. If we were alone, we shouldn't even answer, and now she's telling me to go by myself and at night to open it? My sister, excited that Mum was letting us finally open it, but me having my mum's words ring in my head, told her to go back and I would open it. I did, expecting my grandpa or cousin or somebody that I knew to ask for something like vegetables or something like that. It usually happens. But I open the door and I see this guy with like grey hair, in his 50s, with a wild grin on his face. He had really long teeth and a wide mouth. He was soaked, no umbrella, already grinning when I opened the door, and with his hands behind his back. But before I even said anything, from behind his back, he pulled that doll out, gave it to me, and then just went back downstairs to go outside of the building. I had this gut-wrenching dread and fear. Like, how did this guy that I'd never seen before know my house? How did he know that it was our doll? Why did he go through the trouble to bring it? I ran to the window to see him come out of the building. I waited, and I waited, but he just never came. I just took the doll that had no signs of me beating it or crushing it, and I put it back on the counter. I went back to the living room, and my mum didn't ask me who it was. My sister saw the doll and said, "My doll," but never went to it. I definitely expected her to run to it. I definitely expected my mum to ask who came to the door at like 9 p.m, but nothing. Everybody just did absolutely nothing. The next day, I asked my sister why she didn't play with her doll last night, and she answered, "I don't want it." I asked her multiple times why, and she was sure, but every time she said, "I just don't want it." So I took the doll and I put it in the trash. My parents never asked why the doll was in the trash, and it was thrown out with them, and I luckily never saw it again. Now, the weird thing, though, is that when I questioned my family about that night, they don't really remember it. They don't even really remember my sister having that doll. The whole thing is just really weird, and I can't explain it, even to this day, how everything was just so strange and off at that time. What do you guys think? G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Ana Luisa a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, are you in the market for the perfect gift for yourself or for someone special perhaps? Then look no further than Ana Luisa. Ana Luisa provides beautiful sustainable jewelry that not only looks terrific, but also comes with a great price tag. And for my listeners, I managed to pick up an even better deal with a discount of 10% off of all products. Their jewelry also starts at the affordable price of just $39 with no luxury markup, and I can personally attest to the quality of their product. I decided to get the missus a little something for our anniversary, the Anna Silver necklace from the fine jewelry section, and man, is it a nice piece. The glossy texture and the delicate design are exactly what I was looking for, and the composition of the piece is perfect because it doesn't catch on clothes or hair, which is great for my wife because she now wears it every time that she goes out for business meetings or to catch up with friends. The company also offsets 100% of their carbon emissions, starting with the sourcing of their raw materials all the way up to the disposal of their pieces. Their shipping is excellent and comes with custom taxes included for international customers, and with a 10% discount to boot, you can't go wrong. You can also check them out by following their Instagram or by subscribing to their newsletters, in which they always offer perks for engaged customers. So, go to analuisa.com/scared, that's analuisa.com/scared, and treat yourself and your loved ones with a unique gift and use my code SCARED to get 10% off. I absolutely recommend them. They're a great brand, make beautiful sustainable jewelry, and again, that's analuisa.com/scared. You can also find a link in the description within tonight's episode. Do any of you guys remember Outdoor Ed? If you don't remember or just plain don't know, I'll give you a brief rundown. So, outdoor education, or ED for short, is a school camping trip that takes students to the woods where they can learn more about the outdoors. And my outdoor ed trip took me to the snow-infested mountains, and for the most part it was completely boring, save for the occasional snowball fight. But then, the last night occurred. I'll never forget the last night for as long as I live. Now, before that night, I didn't have any trouble sleeping, but the last night it was like something was just wrong. At first, I assumed it was just sort of homesickness, first time away from my parents. But then I looked at my cabin mates and counselor, and from the look on their faces too, I could tell that they were feeling it as well. It was a sort of tense several minutes, and then something started calling our names. It was barely more than a whisper, but all of us definitely heard it. The voice was sort of seductive in a way, alluring, and it made me want to go outside. But the small amount of common sense that I had back then just made me stay put. My counselor didn't feel the same way, though, and left the cabin to investigate. We could hear him yelling from outside, things like, "Come on guys, this isn't funny, the kids are trying to sleep." I guess that he assumed that it was some sort of a prank. After a few minutes of silence, he rushed back inside, and he said, "Hey guys, there's something or someone out here. Stay here, alright?" He says this, and then he grabs something from his bag and goes back outside. He yells out, "Listen, this is your only warning. I have a gun, and if you intend to hurt these kids, I will shoot." There's silence for some time, and then 2 gunshots. I swear it was the loudest noise that I'd ever heard. I could hear the other counselors come outside, and I hear them talk. I can't hear what they say, but my counselor comes back and says that the rest of the night that we have to stay indoors. Eventually, sleep won out, and I drifted off, but the next morning as the students are boarding the buses to leave, we see police cars on the road and police officers talking to my counselor. Not too long after, my dad shows me the news, and I found out what my counselor saw. He described it as something barely resembling a human, taller than 10 feet and with skin so pale that you would mistake it for snow almost. That was all that he could see before he fired his gun and the creature just ran off. It was on the news because apparently some local called the gunshots in because they heard them. And I really can't imagine just how awkward it was for my camp counselor to try and explain this to police officers, but suffice it to say, I had some nightmares about it, and now I'm forbidden from going on any more camping trips after it. Now that I'm older, though, and a little bit wiser, my best guess is that maybe it was a Wendigo. But this was in Southern California, and it's apparently an unusual place for such a creature. I don't know. It was a weird night, and like I said, it's definitely something that I won't forget. So this all happened a few years ago when I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, somewhere in that age range anyway. As the story is sort of old as well, some parts are filled in with the best that I can remember, but not all of it is exactly as it happened. So I grew up in a medium-sized town where most people knew each other, but it was also a popular place for tourists to visit basically any time of the year. My friend, female, and I, female, had been out at the park for a few hours as the weather was nice. It might be important to mention too that we were both in shorts and t-shirts as it was far too hot for anything else. But my friend, Katie, had suggested that we should go slightly out of town to go to one of our mutual friends' houses. I had never been to this friend's house before, and so I didn't really know where it was or how to get to it, but Katie said that she did. So we started heading up to the house, only to realize that we don't actually know how to get there. But Katie knew the name of the street, so we decided the best point of action at this point is to ask someone for directions, as we were pretty much completely lost. But as we had been out all day and had been walking around for a while, it was getting later in the day and not many people were around. We wandered around before eventually finding somebody to ask, He was a guy, maybe in his late middle age, bald, and he had a stubble beard, and besides that, he was pretty average. We go and ask him if he knew where the street was, and he gives us some really convoluted explanation for directions, and even with a map, I've always really struggled with visualizing directions. And after a couple of seconds of listening to his help, I was completely lost. Once he's done talking, though, we just thank him and start walking off in the direction that he pointed us in, just to avoid awkward silence. Eventually, we stop and look at each other, both confused and tired. Neither of us knew what he said or where to go at this point, and so we decide to just try and get back to town so I can get us back to my house, giving up on the surprise visit. We turn around and start heading back the direction the guy was, but then we see him again walking our way. I smile awkwardly at him and we cross the road to avoid him, as Katie and I don't really know how to interact with people, and I have anxiety, so seeing the dude again really sets off some alarms in my dumb mind. But as you could probably guess by now, this guy crosses the road too. We try to ignore him and keep going back in the direction of my town, but being two small young teens, the guy catches up to us and starts trying to talk to us. I was raised to be polite, but was also told many stories of kids being kidnapped and worse stuff by my mother, so I'm panicking a bit, but trying to talk back and answer some of his questions as to not annoy him. Katie is staring at me like I'm crazy the whole time, and eventually he grabs my arm and Katie's shoulder, and immediately I'm on the verge of tears thinking that I'm for sure going to get kidnapped. He tells us that he's sure that we're going the wrong way and says that his car is just up the street and he could drive us up there if we wanted to. Katie speaks up and says that we're actually just going to head back home and that it's just around the corner, pointing down the street at one of the houses. The guy lets go of us instantly, looking up at the house and falling silent. Katie grabs me and we walk to the house. And once we get to the door, we hesitate at the doorstep. I look over my shoulder, seeing the guy is gone. Once I knew that he was not hiding behind a corner or something, though, I start crying a lot, and we go back to my house without any other issues. When we got back, my parents called Katie's parents, and they talked about the situation before coming to get Katie. I try to describe the guy to my mum, as she knows most of the people in town, as she worked in a popular but small shop. But we ended up being pretty sure that he must have just been a tourist. So, I've had 3 whole months of experiencing creepy stuff when I moved to the province about 4 or 5 years ago. This story would just be way too long if I shared everything, so I wanted to start with this specific topic first. So I had just graduated from college this time. I visited my best friend Erin, who was just 2 hours away via Ro-Ro ship for her son's birthday. And the funny thing is, a big family fight happened. We got kicked out, and we ended up staying at some hotel while searching for an apartment. We found a house near the beach, and immediately we rented it. It was a quiet village, and the house was maybe 5 minutes away from the village gate, but located at the very back. We were staying on the 2nd floor. The 1st floor was sort of an open space for parking and had a garden and whatnot. There were stairs outside that you'd have to take to go up into the house, and I noticed each time that I entered the village, I would smell a sort of scent similar to frangipani flower. It was sweet and delicate, but felt like it was always right under my nose. What surprises me, though, is that I've never seen that tree around this village. I didn't mind it so much, though, until my best friend started bringing it up, saying how it sort of disturbed her. The weird part, though, was that even at work, I eventually found work to help with the expenses, a few people would mention my perfume, even when I don't use one. So one day, I was lying on bed getting ready to sleep when Erin's 10-year-old sister, Anna, approached me with a frightened look on her face. There's someone knocking on the balcony door. What? Is someone stuck outside? No, but I'm scared. I'm a little peeved, confused, but also concerned. So I get my butt up and I go to the balcony door, and I immediately start smelling that floral scent again. Now, our balcony door from the inside was a sort of wooden door, then on the outside, a screen door. I start assuming that maybe Erin is stuck outside, so I yell through the door, "Hey Erin, is that you? Are you stuck outside?" I hear my best friend's voice from the bathroom saying that she's just taking a shower. Right after, I hear 3 knocks from the door though. Anna starts hiding behind my back, and I'm pretty creeped out myself, I must admit. Then I start yelling, "Who's out there?" And another 3 knocks on the door. I'm proper peeved at this point that nobody is answering, and I start to yell that it's not funny. Then whoever or whatever is outside starts knocking frantically on the door. Me and Anna scream and are freaking out. We ran to the bathroom to tell Erin that somebody is knocking outside. Now, you may think that we're overreacting, but the balcony has no tree strong enough for someone to climb up, nor are the trees anywhere near enough to get close to it. But we also have a tall gate with tall walls surrounding the place, so the fact that anybody could be there was really strange. Erin, though, eventually steps out of the shower, sopping wet, mind you, and very annoyed. We tell her what happens, and she looks at us like we're the dumbest people alive. She proceeds to the door and asks who's there. And then the knocking happens again. Midway through the knocking, though, Erin unlocks and opens the door impressively quickly. But then we realize that the screen door, after the wooden door that is locked from the inside, making us wonder how the heck someone could knock on the wooden door in the first place. We open the screen to further check, and when we do, there's just nobody out there. Unsatisfied with this, I quickly ran downstairs to check for anyone. Maybe someone jumped off at the last minute or something, or is trying to escape. But analyzing the place, I tried to convince myself that there's some sick person trying to pull a prank, but there was no one. I go up and I tell Erin that there's nobody there. I slowly retreat to my room where Erin's 2-year-old son is playing with some toys. And then he looks at me and, dead in the eyes, he says, "You let it in." I don't know if he heard what was going on or if it was just coincidental, but the whole situation, it's really creeping me out. When I was 18, I was in a severely abusive relationship. No one knew it from the outside, but my boyfriend at the time was just a monster. We had just spent the evening at my grandmother's house, handing out candy with her. I don't want him there, but he insisted that we go everywhere that I did because he was immensely controlling. After we'd finished up with the trick-or-treaters, he told me that he wanted to go to a neighboring town to see a movie. I had no choice but to agree, so off we went. He decided that he would drive my parents' new vehicle. I was not feeling particularly happy to be spending more time with him, so he started prodding me. We began to fight, and I told him that I didn't want to do this anymore. He sat calmly at a turning section, then jerked the wheel quickly and put my side into oncoming 80km/h traffic. We were almost immediately T-boned. I remember seeing a car coming at me and screaming. Then I was just knocked unconscious. The car had actually caught fire, and he had left me in the vehicle to presumably burn. He didn't even call 911 in the end. We were about 2 kilometers from my parents' rural house, and they had seen the commotion of the fire trucks, the ambulances, the police cars, etc. So they ventured out to see what was happening. I regained consciousness and started panicking upon seeing the smoke coming from the car. I was so dazed, but I was also on the verge of an anxiety attack, so I was freaking out. At this point, I remember hearing a woman's voice saying, "Shush, it's going to be okay. You're okay. Your mum is going to be here soon." I turned, and there were 2 older women with white hair and dressed in white, sitting in the back seat of the car. I had not seen either of them before, and for a town of a couple of hundred people, that was pretty surprising to me. Everyone literally knew everyone, pretty much. But one lady didn't speak to me. The other kept soothing me and reassuring me. She handed me a white blanket and covered my lap and hands. I instantly calmed down, and the next time I regained consciousness, my mother had climbed into the driver's seat and was yelling at me to wake up and asked me what had happened. I was taken by an ambulance to the hospital, but I groggily told my mother of the women and gave her the blanket. She went to one of the cops on the scene and asked to meet the women and to thank them even. He just sort of looked at her puzzled, though, and said that he was apparently the first one on the scene. He also said that there was no way two elderly women could have gotten into the back seat of the vehicle. My mum kept the blanket, though, and she still has it in the cedar chest to this day. We don't talk about it as a family much, but I still think about it a lot. So this happened when I was about 10, I think. For background, I grew up on a rural 18-acre farm out in the middle of nowhere with my little sister and my mother. Occasionally, at night, my father would show up. Long story, but oftentimes, it was just us three. Our property was shaped like a big rectangle almost, with our house on the very edge of the property with a dirt and limestone road in front of it, and the rest of the property extended back behind us. We had some unfriendly neighbours across the dirt road from us, and after that there were some mobile homes a few miles away on the right and the left. My room was in the back of the house with a large window looking out at our fenced backyard that the sheep were in, and then after that there was another fence with a pasture for the goats, and onwards to another pasture with a fence for our ponies. This is relevant too, because in order for anything to be in our backyard, you would have to get past at least one of those fences. Now, one night I was playing with my action figures on the floor around bedtime when I heard a weird knocking noise coming from my window, and I always had the blinds shut at night because I was scared of the dark at that time. Being so young, I immediately panicked and ran into my mum's room in the front of the house and hysterically told her what had happened. She came over to my room and popped the blinds up and looked around, but there was nothing there except for some sheep in the distance. Since we lived in a pretty wooded area, my mother assured me that it was probably just an animal knocking against the wood of our house. And to be honest, this satisfied me at that moment, and I just went back to bed shortly after. A few weeks went by, and occasionally I would hear knocking on my window, which would freak me out, but since I was assured that it was just an animal, I would just go back to sleep. A few more weeks went by, and I hadn't heard anything for a while until one night, very, very late at night, I was awoken by a really loud knocking from what sounded like the glass on my window. This was weirder than normal, but still wasn't overly scary to me. Still, I decided that this particular knock needed an investigation since it sounded so much louder than all the other ones. So I hopped out of bed and creeped up to the window and popped the bottom blind up to see if I could finally spot this animal. And what I saw still gives me shivers to this day. What I saw was a pair of bare human feet with dirty blue jeans and their waist up, obscured by the rest of the blinds. Then, to my mounting horror, the legs shifted and the torso leaned down as the person standing behind my window was attempting to look in through the slot in the blinds that I had made. I screamed as loud as I ever have and ran shrieking past my sister's room, through the living room, the kitchen, and into my mother's bedroom. This sent all the dogs scrambling through the house barking, and woke my sister, who also ran crying, to my mum's room. Luckily for us, my mum was up doing work on her laptop, and through my sobs I explained what happened. To my mother's credit, she took me seriously and locked us all in the bathroom and called 911. We stood there crouched in the bathtub with her for what seemed like hours as the cops tried to find where our house was down the twisting country roads. They eventually showed up, looked around the property, and they found human footprints in the sand outside my window, but nothing else. We ended up leaving for a while to stay at my grandma's house in town, but eventually we went back home after a week. My mother ended up buying an axe, but that was all the protection that we had since she was a major hippie and didn't believe in owning firearms and stuff. There were a few more incidences with knocking, but Each time my mum would check, there was never any person there again, which, to be honest, I'm thankful for. To this day, I always shut the blinds at night, and I never look past the blinds when it's dark. So about 10 years ago, I'm a cocky little thing, 18-year-old dude who thinks he has the world by the balls. The world had me by the balls, I later discovered though. And I was with my very serious girlfriend of 2 years and counting. It was the first time that I'd ever dated a girl, and it really felt like I was in love and could see myself marrying this girl, in fact. Thank God that didn't happen though. That's a whole nother story. But my parents are really strict conservative Christians. They'd never let me and my girlfriend Caitlin share a room at night. Caitlin's parents didn't really care at all, but they let us drink and we had our own bedroom upstairs. Looking back, her mum was kind of not the best mother, but she was nice enough, so yeah, she was alright. Anyway, one weekend in summer, Caitlin and her parents asked if I would like to come up for 3 hours up north to her grandparents' town for their anniversary. This place is hours away from civilization, pretty much as secluded as it gets, in fact. You even see some Amish people the whole way up there, northern Michigan if anyone would like to know. So I said, yeah, okay. Her grandparents are pretty wealthy and fun, and I knew that it was going to be a fun time. But too many people stayed in their really big, lovely house, so we had to rent a cabin in the woods. This cabin is at least 20 minutes from the village or town or whatever. And right away, it just seemed a bit off. It was back in the woods off this sort of creepy, secluded and quiet dirt road. Everything was completely silent. The house next to us was dead silent and empty. And it was just us there. I'm not too worried about it at all because I have this wonderful and fleeting confidence that alcohol and the possibility of getting some action this weekend is on the menu. So I'll skip the daytime activities as they don't really matter all that much here. We basically just had a regular fun time with the family and we returned to our cabin for the night. Now, our room was upstairs in this sort of loft area. This cabin was oldish and rustic and just, well, empty for a lack of a better term. Not physically empty, but just void of something. The kind of emptiness that you can almost feel, but hey, we're out in the woods and no one has probably been here, like, in ages. So, of course it feels kind of dead in here, right? That night, though, was when it happened. And I'm positive that I'll miss a bunch of details as I sort of blocked out the memory as best as I could until, well, I saw this place and it came back. So, I'm sleeping in this really awful mattress next to Caitlin, and I drift off and have the most horrible nightmares. They weren't dreams, though. It was sort of real. It was as though my soul was able to move around and even interact with the bedroom, and I could even see our bodies were lying fast asleep there. But I was sort of awake. My body was asleep, but I was somehow completely mobile without a body. It was a weird dream, and to be honest, I thought that that's all it was. The bedroom was dark, and the moonlight from the window lit up the center of the room. There were so many people there, all deceased, standing in a circle, sort of chanting. In the center of their circle, I see a little girl with blonde hair, maybe 7 years old, and she's in this white dress, almost glowing too in the most disturbing way. The people turn to me as they notice that I'm watching and am aware of the fact that I'm there, and they slowly approach me all chanting and murmuring. I can't remember the words exactly, but I'm positive that they were performing some sort of a ritual or sacrifice to kill this girl. It was like the scene from Rosemary's Baby, something that I never saw till very recently, but that's the best way to describe it. Anyway, they came to me with their hands outstretched, looking dead and sort of rotten, and as they begin to strangle me, I wake up. And waking up is usually when everything goes back to normal, right? But I wake up and see the rocking chair is rocking. like flying as if someone had slammed into it. At this point, I'm just like, nope. And I close my eyes and I just pray and hope the sun will rise soon. It didn't though, and unfortunately, at some point, I fell back to sleep. The next dream goes like this. I'm on a roller coaster with all sorts of people and it's going straight to the sky up into heaven. I'm happy and stoked and cheering, and right before we get to the pearly gates, the roller coaster goes down, straight down, into the earth and into the fire and into hell. And all I can hear is blood-curdling screams for help and screams of murder. So much agony and terror. It was honestly one of the most awful things that I've ever experienced, and I could feel the burning of the fire and the pain of the screams just surrounding me in every way. Finally, though, I wake up and the sun is up. I'm covered in sweat and I look over to see my girlfriend in the fetal position, shaking and crying. I ask her what's wrong, knowing that I think I already know the answer, hoping that it was something else. And all she could say was, the girl, over and over again. I asked her what happened, and she said that she saw a little girl in a white dress standing in the middle of the room staring at us and dancing, and she claimed that she wasn't even asleep. She went on to explain too how she had waken up periodically to see the rocking chair just rocking back and forth like I had. Mind you, I hadn't said a word about everything that I had experienced yet, and she pretty much confirmed everything, which obviously only made everything so much worse. I don't really have an exciting end to this story, too. You see, the next night and the night after that, I just didn't sleep. There was a Porn Stars marathon on TV, thank God, and I stayed up all night with the lights blasting from that to stay awake. I didn't sleep again, in fact, until the car ride home. Caitlin and I talked about it, I think maybe once or twice after that, and then we just never spoke of it again. I guess that I'll never really know what actually happened that night, or if I was just going crazy or something. All I can say for sure is that I'm never going anywhere near that town again. As much as I would like answers, I would rather just forget about, well, all of this. In 2009, I was a delivery driver for a place that I won't name. I'd been a delivery driver for a while at this point, and I loved the job. I'm super extroverted anyway and love chatting with people, and it was just fun. I also had my fair share of mildly creepy encounters, given that I'm a girl and I was delivering in one of the sketchier areas of my city. I never thought really much of any of them, or saw any real threat. But one night in particular has always stuck with me. I worked the night shift, so from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. At around 8 p.m. this night, some guy ordered his food and the delivery was easy enough. His house was kind of creepy. Like, there were no lights, and when he answered the door, there was a foul smell that immediately hit me. He also didn't say anything, and I said my usual, there's that for you, and could I get you to fill this out? The tip thing. But he didn't reply at all, or even acknowledge me asking him to sign the slip. I didn't think too much of it, and I just headed back to the store. And almost exactly when I arrived back, another order popped up to the same house, and he had ordered the exact same thing. I was confused, but still not too worried, and took the delivery and had the same experience. No lights on, smelled terrible, and he didn't say a word. I headed back to the store feeling pretty uncomfortable, but again didn't think too much of it. But I started to get extremely uncomfortable when I arrived back to the store and another identical order was up. My manager at the time, unfortunately, didn't understand the creepiness of the whole thing and insisted that I take it. Despite my reluctance, I took it. But this time when he opened the door, I told him, "You can order more than one sandwich at a time, you know," as a sort of attempt at humor. He didn't say anything and just closed the door. I was thoroughly creeped out, and I did a sort of sprint back to the car, and when I looked back at the house, I noticed that a light was on, and I saw someone standing at the window. I couldn't make out any features, but I just assumed that it was him. In the end, I still don't know who was standing in the window or why. My manager called me from the store before I was even able to start my car to inform me that another identical delivery had popped up, and he directed me to leave as quickly as I could because he was starting to see the danger of the situation. As the call ended, I saw the man running up to my car. I couldn't move for a second because, honestly, I was just in shock, but he was yelling something that I couldn't understand. I just sped away as fast as I possibly could, given that I was shaking like a leaf. But we blacklisted this guy that night after he made several attempts to call the store. I still have no idea what his endgame was or who that other person was up the stairs. Was this an attempt to have me come back so that they could do something to me? Was that person upstairs the one ordering this stuff? And did they need help? I'm still puzzled by the whole situation, but man, was it creepy. So this happened a few months ago. A new guy joined my boarding school, and he was this skinny dude that, even though he seemed a little bit off, he was extremely nice. But anyway, we immediately hit it off quite well since we had pretty similar music taste. He was a little bit weird, but overall a charming normal dude. He wouldn't get along with most people though, so I felt some sort of responsibility, I guess you could say, to make him feel welcome and at home. I would help him out with cigarettes when he needed any, and generally I was just very kind to him. Now, one time I arranged to meet up with him and with my girl outside of my boarding school since we would get the weekend off. And so we met in the central city of where I lived and decided to just get some drinks and sit at a park. It was getting late and the conversation was flowing and everyone was having fun. He kept being his weird but fun self until, well, he just sort of snapped. I know for a fact that he wasn't drunk since we were drinking beers and he only had one, but he suddenly just had this crazy look and kept holding onto my girl really hard. I could see she started to panic, so I just pushed him off. He calmed down for a second, and then he picked something up from the floor and tried to shove it into her mouth. At that point, I charged at him at full speed and threw him to the ground. I held my fist up, and he immediately started to apologize, but he would only say, "I'm sorry," over and over again. Once I got up, he immediately tried to charge towards her as if I didn't just tackle him down. I stopped him again before he could touch her and threw him on the ground again. I gave him a few punches, but eventually I stopped. Something about his expression just really scared me. He had this look like he just wasn't even there. It was like he had one goal, which I didn't want to find out. I put him in a headlock and got him far away from my girl and where we were sitting. I then pushed him as hard as I could and went to my girl and we left. He kept trying to follow us for a while until I went up to him. He still had this weird sort of hollow look on his face though. I tried getting him to leave until finally I told him, "Look man, we forgot something back in the park. Can you go bring it?" Somehow that dumb idea worked. He started walking back. The second that he was out of sight, me and my girl just ran for it and took the first bus home. That's not all, because he texted me a couple of times since that happened, and some of those text messages were real strange. If there's any interest, I'll potentially post an update explaining what happened and upload some screenshots. But for now, I don't know what the heck happened that night. I don't know why he acted like that. It just all sort of was out of the blue, but I'm not really friends with him anymore, so I guess it won't happen again. Hopefully. To start off, I just want to make it clear that I have had several paranormal things happen in my life. Enough times, too, that I'm now a believer in the fact that there is another realm or world or whatever you may call it. My husband, however, has never had anything happen to him and has never been a believer. He's always told me, I believe that you thought you saw that, or I believe that you believe that happened. And my response has always been, well, you'll believe it when you see it, because someday you're going to. So, here we are. His day has come. We were in the kitchen making dinner last night. He's at the stove. My back is towards him because I'm just chopping the veggies up. I turn around to hand them to him, and I see him running to the living room, searching around the corner. And then he returns with this wide-eyed and confused look on his face. I ask him what's wrong, and he says, I just saw someone cross through the hallway and into the living room. First, I try to find a logical explanation. Maybe you saw someone walk past the outside window or something like that. He looks at me, though, and says, no, I'm telling you that I saw a woman in here walk through to the living room just then. He also said that the woman had on jeans and a plaid shirt. We realized today that yesterday was actually the first year anniversary of his cousin's death. She was only 29 and died of an overdose, and she always wore jeans and plaid button-ups. This happened 2 years ago in June or July in Poland, where we live. I got a call from my aunt asking if I could come and meet her where she works, and I agreed, and we met about 30 minutes afterwards. She asked me if I could look at the place where she worked because, well, she needs to leave to see her boyfriend. I asked why, and she explained that just before she called me, Dee had called her, and he and two of his friends, F and J, were on a road trip not far away from where we live, and they decided that they wanted to do a trip to shoot with some wind cheater guns for fun. They decided to drive to a point on a hill where a small old bunker is. The bunker is so small, though, that only 2 people can enter it. It's only one room with windows fronting every direction. It's there because of World War II. We live on the border with Germany. And my aunt said that, for now, that's all she knows, and she needs to go to get them from there because somehow they can't leave or something. And then she added that all of them were scared to their cores, so she asked me to cover. So I stayed there to do her job and watch the shop and whatnot, which is a cigarette shop, and waited for them to come back. They got back in less than 10 minutes. As I said before, they were close to our location. When they left the car, my aunt's boyfriend sat in the front shop with his friends, and they were, pale from fear. When I say pale, too, I mean their faces were basically white, and they weren't saying any words. I waited patiently for them to tell me what happened, and one of his friends eventually started talking. So when they arrived at the spot, everything was fine. They went out of the car and started to prepare their air guns. They went on the roof of the bunker, which was around 1.5 meters high, and started to just shoot for fun. They were shooting rocks and trees and stuff like that, and no people were around because there are no houses there. As they finished, they started going down from the bunker, and it was in that moment when he noticed that something was really strange. Their car was standing there in plain sight around 10 meters from where they were shooting from. At first glance, nothing had changed, but then he noticed that there were bricks piled up on the ground, up to the chassis of the car around every single wheel. It was like they drove straight into the middle of some kind of a wall, but don't forget that this was an area close to an old bunker with an old dirt road. What I mean is that there was 0% possibility that they had not noticed it after leaving the car. But upon seeing this, all 3 of them went to the car and they locked themselves in. Dee was the one who was driving that day. He started the car normally, but the vehicle just couldn't move. These little walls around the wheel were strong enough to prevent them from driving away. They all started panicking at that point. Jay ran out of the car and started to kick the bricks to set the car free and whatnot. At some point he was certain that it was enough and that the walls were destroyed to the point that they could leave now, so he got back in the car. Dee tried again, but now the car wouldn't even start. The third guy eventually called a friend from a city close to their location and asked if he could tow their car to the city. He agreed, and after 10 or 15 minutes he called them back. He was standing on the road down the hill, and he could see them. At one stage too, he called them to ask for directions, because somehow he couldn't find the way that led up the hill. And at some point, he started screaming that something came out of the woods near them, and is running right at their car. F said that the guy was screaming like he was afraid for his life. The only problem was that they weren't seeing anything. Nothing had left the woods, which they were all seeing right in front of them up close. And at this point, they're all sort of freaking out, and everyone's sort of acting hectically. The funny thing is, though, is that the guy who was supposed to help them just hung up and ended up leaving. After a couple of minutes of shouting and straight-up panic, they managed to stay quiet for a moment, just to try and hear if anything is walking nearby or something. And after a few seconds of silence, something knocked on the window of their car, and the knock sounded like it was made with some sort of a metal object. It was the window as well that was on the right side of the car, the window that was facing the forest. And after that, Dee called my aunt, and then she called me, and then she went out to get them as soon as I was at her job. Dee was really scared while telling us what happened, but that's not the strangest thing. The weirdest thing is that his two buddies were silent as a tomb. They hadn't spoken a word since they arrived at my aunt's job, and she told me a couple of weeks after that they were pretty strange after the incident. No one is talking about that day anymore, but I'm still really curious about what actually happened in that forest. Before I start this, I just want to say that I am not afraid of the dark. I've been spelunking and turned off the lights in a pitch-black cave. I've been camping in the woods during new moons. I've slept alone at relatives' houses before. The only place that I've ever felt truly terrified in the darkness is my family home, in a town just on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. I'm going to give the most prevalent examples of why, but this is going to be pretty long, so strap in. So when I was about 6 years old, I had plenty of stuffed animals. I was unafraid of the dark back then, so I didn't have any light or something like that. But I would often wake up and find that the toy that I had brought with me to bed was just gone, and I would find it in a completely separate area of the house. From this point, I assumed that I must have been sleepwalking. It was such a regular occurrence, in fact, that neither I nor my parents thought much of it. But the only thing odd was that I always ended up back in my bed, while whatever I was holding was in another room. But this all changed when I was around 8 years old. This time when I woke up, I was always in a very uncomfortable position and in an unfamiliar area. I quickly panicked as I could see almost nothing since the room was so dark. I felt in front of me, and it only took me a few seconds to realize that I had woken up inside of my very small closet, and the closet door was closed, sealing me in there. I opened the closet door, left my room, and I told my parents. We had a bit of a laugh about it because it was weird, sure, but as I said before, we all just assumed that I was just sleepwalking. The next experience I had to have happened only within a week or so of the last one. But I woke up late at night and immediately felt just really cold. It was like my hairs were standing on end for no particular reason. I felt a strong surge to leave the room as quickly as I could. Since the room was so dark, there was only one thing to guide me to my door. Outside of my room is a hallway leading to my sister's room and branches to a bathroom. The light was on in the bathroom, and so, because of the colour of the wallpaper, the light coming from under the crack under my door was a sort of pale green colour. As always, I followed the green light to what I thought was my door, but I couldn't find the handle. I felt scared, and I was getting frantic searching the whole wall for a handle, and the darkness seemed to press down on me. And then I heard my name whispered behind me. I felt the wall next to me for my light switch, but it wasn't there either. So I began screaming, and I banged on everything that I could touch, still seeing that pale green light under the door in front of me. About 20 seconds later, my lights turn on and my parents entered the room behind me. I wasn't even close to the door, even though I could clearly see the light. I was on the opposite wall from the door. Suffice it to say, this was the time that I decided that I needed to get a nightlight. And then, the next experience, and this one is the most frightening in my opinion. So I was around 14 years old. I still slept with a nightlight, but then it was broken for some reason and we needed a new bulb to replace the dead one or something. Which, in my head at the time, was no problem. I could go one night without a nightlight after all. In the end, I just kept my door open as well, and the bathroom light in the hallway was enough for me to see. And that was really the only reason why I was able to see what I did. I should say, too, that I'm a very paranoid person by nature. I kept a knife under my pillow for the longest time, and even a flashlight under the pillow next to me. And when I slept that night, I had the distinct impression that I was being watched. To cope, I would close my eyes and count in my head for a few seconds, no more than 2 or 3, before opening them again to check the area around me. Keep in mind, this did not work. If anything, it kept me awake longer because of fear. This time, though, I got brave. I closed my eyes and I counted 1, 2, 3, all the way to 7, and on 7, I heard a sound. You know the sound of soft footsteps on carpet? Well, I heard that, and so I opened my eyes, and to my horror, I saw a thing crawl from the ground and onto my wall and crawl towards me. I couldn't tell what gender it looked like, only that it had long black hair and yellow eyes with a thin frame and pale skin. It also appeared to be wearing something on its back, like a rug or a pelt or something. I also noticed just a terrible smell in the air, like the smell of rot. I watched it for all of about 2 seconds while I quickly reached for the flashlight. I looked down at the flashlight to find the damn button, and when I turned it on, that thing was gone. Only my mother and I know this story because I've never really told anyone. Growing up a devout Catholic, my initial impression was that a demon had entered my home. I had a seminarian friend who was a collector of relics. Earlier, I had actually touched a small metal cross that I owned to these relics, including a splinter thought to be one from the wood of Christ's cross. This effectively made my small metal cross what is called a third-degree relic. We had the house blessed, and I took to sleeping with that cross under the pillow. Since then, I've never been approached by whatever that thing was again, so honestly, I thought it was over. The next one has happened 4 times after that last experience. So in one part of my house, like a playroom or sort of an office area, we have one of those pull-out couches that transforms into a really crappy bed. When we have company, like relatives stay the night, they sleep in my bed, and often I sleep in that one. And every single time that I've slept there, I have seen it again. Due to the layout of this room, it's impossible to cover the entire room in light without just leaving the ceiling lights on. Thus, my nightlight couldn't reach a particular dark corner of said room. When I closed my eyes on these 4 separate occasions, I could hear like ragged breathing or something in the room with me. When I looked around, all I could see was the outline of a sort of dark shape huddled in that corner, rocking back and forth on its heels. I was terrified, obviously, but also confident. I still had my cross under my pillow after all, so I knew that I was safe. Fast forward to now, and I'm back from college because of COVID-19, and I'm staying with my parents. And the first thing that I did was place that same cross under my pillow. I just had to be sure, but yesterday, I made a mistake. And man, am I stupid. For some reason, I was watching YouTube videos about ghost stories, and I guess that I felt invincible. And I made fun of the thing, who clearly had not left when I had, as I still heard whispers in the dark, and I challenged it. Nothing happened that night, but today, though, I was taking my sheets off to wash them when I noticed that it was gone. My relic, that is. The only thing that I believe has kept me safe all this time. It happened when I turned my lights off, and when I came back, it was just gone. I'm worried about what happens now because clearly this isn't over. I'm wondering too if anyone knows what this thing might be. If I knew what it was, I might be able to learn how to deal with it. It definitely doesn't cause the telltale ghost signs like flickering lights and static and all that sort of stuff. It only moves in the shadows. Plus, a priest blessed this house and it was able to move my cross, so I don't know. Maybe it's not a demon? Until I challenged it too, it never seemed malicious, only sort of scary. Now I'm really not so sure anymore. I think that I'll be sleeping with the lights on tonight. I'll be sure to update if anything happens. So I was in hospital waiting for a space on labour ward so I could be induced to have my baby. I was very uncomfortable and was told walking around might help move things in the right direction. Me and my partner decided to walk down to the main foyer of the maternity hospital and walk around the hospital grounds and stuff. It was about 2 a.m, but it was July, so it was a nice mild evening. As we came out of the stairwell onto the bottom floor, I had a painful contraction and had to sit down on the chairs at the door. Me and my partner were just sort of chatting after the pain subsided when the automatic doors opened and a very large man walked in. He looked at us with a really crazed look in his eyes, muttered something, then took off down the corridor grunting. I was thinking, that's odd, when my boyfriend practically lifted me off the seat and hissed under his breath at me to move now, and ran with me towards the lift. Bearing in mind, I'm 9 months pregnant, and in the early stages of labour, so I'm not exactly in shape to move fast anywhere. Once I got in the lift, I'm completely bewildered, and asked my boyfriend, what the heck was that about? He then shakily asked me if I saw the 2 massive rocks the man had in his hands. And no, I did not. As soon as we got into the ward, we informed the charge nurse, and she basically locked the entire maternity unit down until the police came to remove this guy. But it turns out that he ran out of the main hospital up the hill after being admitted to having a mental health crisis, I think. I don't know. I'm just so glad that he didn't hurt anyone and didn't hurt us, and that my partner was switched on enough to notice that this guy had some rocks in his hands, because that's pretty terrifying. When I, a 21-year-old female, was 17, I wanted to au pair, and the only place close to me that I could go to as a 17-year-old was England. So I found this family, a mother with 2 kids, boy and a girl. I messaged them and talked with the mother, and she seemed very interested and very nice. So we set up a date for me to go, and that was that. When I got to the airport, I was very confused that they weren't there to pick me up, though. I messaged the mother to ask her where they were, and if it would be a long time for them to come and get me. She told me that she was on her way, and it was just sort of stuck in traffic or something, and I thought, okay, that's fair enough. She told me to go to the exit and wait. Then, not long after, she told me that she was there and that she was in a blue car. I was looking around, very confused, since I couldn't really see any blue cars there. When I finally found it, some other woman than the one that I had been talking to walked out of the car and towards me. The instant that I made eye contact with the other woman, I got a long text from the woman that I was supposed to work for, where it basically said that her husband had come from the country that he worked in and that they had fought because he didn't want an au pair in the house, and for some reason she didn't want to tell me that, so she just gave me to her good friend who needed an au pair. I was very confused by this, obviously, and by that time a little bit scared too. It all seemed very weird, as if someone was watching me and had been waiting for the right moment to send that text. The woman seemed very friendly though, but was hurrying with taking my things and putting it in her car while talking to me. I am a bit nervous and non-confrontational by nature, so I didn't really know what to do or say other than just follow her and what she was doing. When it was all done, she told me that we should get going, and I told her that I wasn't really comfortable with it all. She told me that she understood, but that she really needed the help and also only had 2 children at home. We had to move fast because of the place that she was parked, so we got in the car and started driving out of the airport pickup spot. The second that we started moving, I told her that I was very uncomfortable with this and really wanted to get out and stay at the airport. She seemed a bit upset by this and told me that, sure, she could drop me off, but she had to get out of where we were because she could get a ticket for letting me out there or something like that. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's just what she told me. We drove for a few minutes, still on the airport grounds, and we stopped a bit away so I could get out and call my parents. I talked to them, pretty much sobbing the whole time. And I noticed that while I was talking to them, the woman was inside her car talking to a woman. The one that I'd been talking to, I presume? I didn't understand the language, so I can't say what they were talking about. But when I was done talking, I got into the car again, and I told her that I really wanted her to let me out. And she kept asking me if I was sure that I didn't want to go into town with her or something, if I didn't want her to drop me off by the shopping centre. I, of course, told her no, that I really want her to just let me out by the airport. She did, thankfully, and I went inside and talked with my parents. After this happened, I got some really weird voice memos from her and 2 other people. I couldn't understand them, but it was very weird. My parents also tried contacting her, and she blocked them both. If you don't know, a lot of au pairs are being treated very poorly, so for us to feel safe and secure and sure that we don't get cheated out of pay or working more than we are allowed, we have to sign a contract. And later on, I found out that the contract that she had sent me was actually fake and not really binding. I don't know how, but it wasn't legitimate apparently. Plus, her addresses that she had sent me were also fake. She apparently didn't live at either of them. I found out later on that the city that I was in was a bit of a hotspot for trafficking as well. I didn't know this until after this had happened, but it was just a lot of very sketchy stuff. And of course, I could be overthinking this one, I admit. It might not be as bad as I think it was, but in the moment of it, I was sure that something was going down. In 2006, my mum, she went on an overnight business trip and brought something back with her. My parents were in the middle of a divorce, which meant that I think it was the perfect time for something to attach itself. The morning that she got back from the trip, she was telling us about all the creepy things that happened in her hotel room, and she had just told us that the TV kept turning on when all of a sudden our stereo turned on at full blast. We all sat there in shock, just sort of looking at each other before my brother got up to turn it off. We immediately stopped talking about it and went on about our day. And for the next 4 years, we would all experience odd happenings, but they were always small enough that we could write them off as something else. That was until 2010, when my mum moved into a new house that had just been built. So right off the bat, we all noticed just how dark this house was. It could be a sunny summer day and the inside of the house would look dark and just bleak. The ghostly happenings in that house initially started with my brother. His room was situated in the front of the house, just next to the formal living room, which we used as a computer room. He would tell my mum and my sister that he would wake up in the early hours of the morning to the sound of someone typing on the computer. When we would get up to check, the monitor would be on, but there would be no one at the computer. One night in particular, he woke up to the sound of typing, went out to investigate, and saw the monitor was on again, but this time the chair was spinning in a sort of slow circle, as if someone had gotten up and walked away in a hurry. When he told my mum the next morning, she assured him that it must have been a dream and to just ignore it if he's ever woken up again by it. He listened to her advice and the computer stopped turning on in the middle of the night for a while, but it started up again a couple of months later, and this time it was accompanied by something else. This was when my brother saw a full-body apparition. He told me years later that he saw what he thought was me standing in his doorway one night. He said that he opened his eyes, saw me standing there, and told me to go back to sleep. When he opened his eyes again, he saw me crouching down by his bedside at eye level, staring at him. He quickly sat up in bed, rubbed the sleep out of his eyes, looked around the room, and saw that he was now completely alone. He got up sort of in disbelief, walked over to my room, and apparently saw me fast asleep in my own bed. It was that night that he left the house, and he never stayed past 8 o'clock again. Once this thing had driven my brother away, it seemed to target my sister as well. She recalls experiencing similar things. She'd see my brother or me crouching at her bedside or in her doorway, and she would hear cabinets in the kitchen opening and closing. She woke up one morning to a package of Oreos sitting open on the counter with all the cookies smashed to bits, and she had been home alone that night, so there was just no explanation as to who did it. None of this scared her, though, and she didn't experience anything besides those few occurrences. But this is when I started to experience strange things. At the time, I was 10 years old, and I had no idea what had been happening to my brother and sister in our house. They didn't want to scare me. For me, though, it started by seeing shadow people in the hallway, multiple times a day too, and the kitchen cabinets would always be open, even if no one had been in the kitchen all day. But then one night, I saw it. It was a normal school night, and I was lying in my mum's bed reading a book. Her bedroom had its own bathroom attached with 2 sinks, with 2 huge round mirrors facing the doorway that connected the 2 rooms, with her bed facing the door. And as I was reading my book, I got the sudden urge to look up and into the mirror on the right side of her bathroom. And what I saw haunts me to this day. At first glance, I honestly thought that it was my brother, so I looked away, but that's when I remembered that my brother had, left an hour ago. My eyes shot back up to the mirror, and I got a good look at what was looking back at me in the reflection of the mirror. It was tall, and it had a big mess of hair plopped on top of its head. Its skin was grey, and its face had no features. It had no nose. In place of its eyes, it had 2 sort of gaping black holes. It had no lips, and in place of those was a black hole as well. I sat there staring at it for what must have been a couple of seconds, and even though it had no eyes, I just knew that it was looking at me. Well, I screamed and threw the blankets over my head, pleading for my mum in my fit of terror. She came running in and pulled the blankets off of me and asked me what happened. I was shaking as I told her what I saw, and I remember seeing fear just grow in her eyes as she looked over her shoulder into the bathroom. To ease my mind, she told me that it was common for mirrors to play tricks on people's eyes and that I was probably imagining it because of the book that I was reading. We did move out a few months after that incident, and I haven't experienced anything like that since I lived there. To this day, I have no idea who or what was tormenting us for the years that we lived there, and maybe we'll never know, but I'm just glad that it didn't follow us. So I'm 30-some years old. I lived at my brother's house for my whole childhood. No one died there that I know of. The house was built in the 60s or 70s, and everyone in my house had experienced seeing shadow people. More or less, I wanted to share my experiences because the people that haven't had paranormal experiences just look at me weird, so I figured some of you guys might not do that. When I was roughly around 10 years old, my mum and younger sister were all laying in bed. The bed was a bunk bed with a twin upper bed and full-size lower bed. I was laying next to my mum and my younger sister was up top asleep. My mum and I were reading books and just talking occasionally, when I heard the floor creak and looked up at the doorway. And there was a black figure. Half of their body was in the bedroom, their hands sort of wrapped around the doorway like they were just peeking. It seemed to be about 5 feet tall, and the thing that I remember the most were its piercing green eyes. No one else saw it though, because as soon as I saw it, it ducked back around the corner and I went out to take a look, but it was gone. The figure that we all saw the most though was a tall, broad, male-looking figure. The reason that I say male is because he was really big and wide. You never see anything beside his silhouette though, but when I was 22, I moved back after having my daughter to live with my mum to help with my dad. He was dying at the time. My dad would pass 3 months before the next incident, but this figure was not my father. I unfortunately never got to see him, but I woke up to make my daughter a bottle. I left the same room as the last story and walked into the hallway leading into the living room. Now, the living room has this big picture window across the room. The windows give light from the passing cars, the moon, or any outdoor light. We were looking at the ground and shuffling through at about 2 or 3 in the morning and looked up and saw the tall dark silhouette just standing about 3 feet from me. Now, he was really big, but this time I noticed that he was wearing a wide-brimmed hat. I ran to the kitchen and hit the closet light, but when I did, it was gone. To be honest with you as well, I didn't even think paranormal at first. I mean, it looked so real and the whole hat thing was just really odd, and so I thought intruder maybe? Like I said, when I turned around, there was nobody there. My mother and sister still live there, and they experience random things occasionally. We've never been hurt, thankfully, but I don't know. Have any of you guys ever had experiences of piercing green eyes or shadowy figures? A tall brimmed hat man? I know, it sounds really weird, but it's the truth, and I'm hoping that you guys might know more about this. I want to lead this by saying that I have never been into anything paranormal. I'm not sure how I feel on the topic, to be honest, and I suppose you could say that I've never really believed. I still don't know how to feel, but I can say that I've never seen something out of the corner of my eye so consistently and often, and at least when I have, it's always been something distinguishably different from the last. We bought a house, and I got no weird feelings from it like I did at other houses. My house has one room that is deteriorated from water and needs to be redone, and with the doorknob removed, the latch on the outside of the door, it's a little bit unsettling to say the least. We sort of call it the dungeon. But the first night in our new room, my husband was with me, so I can confirm that I'm not alone in at least one of these. We were sitting so we can see directly down the hall. The 2 kids' rooms are at either end. We hear a sound and expect it's one of them trying to creep out. We think that we've confirmed it because we see a shadow move on the wall and another creak. I tell him to go investigate, and he insists that our son was fast asleep and he couldn't have gotten back to bed that fast without much more noise. The cat was asleep in my daughter's room as well, sitting sort of loaf style with his nose touching the wall. That was also very unusual for him, but we just moved, so I let it go. My dog barked and growled at my bedroom ceiling for the first few nights, though. Also odd, but we just moved and he's a puppy, so I only joked about how dogs can see things that we don't and forgot about it. Since then, I have had several moments where I see movement at the top of the stairs. It's always the same color, I guess. I wish I could say that I was joking, but the only way that I can describe it is sort of like cloud-colored. And almost every time it is movement towards one specific room, but it comes from different angles. By the time that I look, it's already went behind the corner though, and there's never anyone upstairs when I see these. The first time that I saw it too, not out of the corner of my eye, I thought that I was watching a fur tumbleweed bounce down the stairs. We have a golden retriever, and it does happen, believe it or not. I got up to retrieve the ball of hair, and when I did, there was nothing there. But I sat there and watched it slowly and softly bounce down at least 3 steps. this was like 20 seconds worth of intense staring. I didn't have my glasses on, so the detail wasn't all there, but it was what I imagine a fur tumbleweed would look like to me from that distance. It moved strangely though, but I guess we're still learning where all of the drafts come in at, so I shrugged it off, but still mentioned it to my husband because we both still chuckle about the first night. But today was the worst. So I'd come out of the bathroom, which leaves a sort of direct line of sight into my bedroom, and I could have sworn that I saw the dog jump off the bed, and I even heard the corresponding thump. Our dog is very light, so in the dark, when the light hits him just right, he has a sort of ominous-looking blur, and I'm pretty used to it. But then I remembered that I had just let the dog outside. I called down to the husband and the kids and asked where the cat was, and he confirmed that he was perched in the window. I don't know what I think of all of this, but I feel like I'm going a little bit crazy. Anyway, I just needed to share this with a group of people who don't completely think that I'm nuts, so thanks for listening. In October of 2018, I moved in with my girlfriend for the first time ever. Her name was Jane, and if I knew everything that was going to happen in the next 5 months that would follow, I really never would have. So the night that everything started is pretty important, and I'll come back to this day later in the story as well. One night, my now ex-girlfriend's mother and brother stayed over. I was feeling well, so I relaxed in our bedroom while they hung out on the porch very late into the night, and at one point, Jane came in and asked me if I needed anything, and checked up on me just to see if I was doing alright. A little while after that, I'm in bed alone with my eyes closed, and I swear to you that I felt a hand on my arm and I opened my eyes, and Jane was kneeling next to our bed, touching me, and asked if I needed anything again. She had a really condescending look on her face, which initially just annoyed me, and I replied that I was fine, and I closed my eyes again, hoping that she would just let me rest. A minute later, I opened my eyes again because I didn't hear her leave the room or open the door to leave. But she was gone. I looked next to the bed because I was thinking, is this crazy chick laying on the floor or something? She wasn't. I looked at the door and I saw the hallway light coming from underneath it. Now, I was never asleep, and I was questioning how I never saw the light shine in when she came in the room or heard it or something. I went to text her to see if she had just come in the room again, but then decided against it. I didn't ask at this point because I didn't want to seem crazy to her family that was over, and I honestly knew right there and then that she never came into the room. I do remember a few nights after that just sort of laying in bed with her and feeling a hand touch my thigh, and I felt the fingers drag away. She was asleep though, but I guess it could have been her. I told her about that first night eventually, and we both just agreed that it was really weird, and then just sort of brushed it off. About a week after that first incident though, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I saw what I can only describe as a black sphere just floating in the corner of the room near the ceiling. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and at this point I'm wide awake, and it's definitely still there. It started to move towards me across the room. It got about a foot from my face, and I just sort of stared at it. And what I saw were facial features, more lion-like than human, but I remember big teeth, and what instantly stood out to me was that this face looked very condescending again. I felt like whatever this was wanted me to know that it was the same thing that I crossed paths with maybe a week prior. Eventually it just dissipated, and I told Jane about things that were happening. She never thought that I was lying, but I'll admit that there were times that I seriously started to question myself. That is, until things started happening to other people around me too. But I'll get into that soon. So one day I went out onto our back porch to have a smoke, and when I stepped outside, the porch light dimmed a little way down. I thought that somebody had turned a machine on in the house or something, and I went to tighten the bulb, but there was a glass fixture around it that was screwed in, and I just decided that I didn't feel like getting a screwdriver, and a minute or so later it came back on full strength anyways. This porch as well can't be accessed from anywhere but inside the apartment. It's screened in and there's no door from the outside. The next day I get home from work and I went to the porch, and the glass fixture that was screwed in tightly just the night before was smashed to absolute oblivion. And I don't mean just below where it was, I mean it was smashed all across the porch. And this was really weird too because, well, it was a nice day. There was no breeze and I just couldn't come up with an explanation as to how it happened. Jane once saw a water bottle get smacked off the dresser when I was in the bathroom once as well. And one night I woke up because it sounded like someone was throwing pebbles from across the room and they were hitting the headboard. I sat up several times looking around. I'd lay down and it would start again. I thought that I started to hear whispering from across the room, and then it grew louder and louder, and I sat up and it began to be loud enough to make out that it was a man's voice and it wasn't speaking English. And this is when I got really scared for the first time, I think. I went to wake up Jane, but I couldn't move. I sat there frozen and the voice got overwhelming. And it was honestly like I just had to take it, and it just had power stronger than mine. Finally, my joints started to work again though, and I was drenched in sweat. I was also so drained that I just fell asleep, like almost passed out. And in the end, I didn't even bother telling Jane because, well, I don't know, maybe it was sleep paralysis or something. I want to mention too that as things got wilder in the apartment, my relationship with Jane became more toxic. I had feelings of anger that I never felt before. Our fights were just out of control. I'd never reached this point in any relationship before this. But when we would make up and be hugging it out and crying and all that, almost like clockwork, stuff would get smashed in the house. Dishes, lamps, you name it. And I'm positive that whatever that we were dealing with did not want anything good between her and I. One time as well, I woke up in the middle of the night to me feeling pressure on the mattress next to me. I woke up and I looked to see an old man with a top hat sitting there just staring at me. I jumped up and yelled, and he casually stood up and put his coat on that he had laying across his lap. He walked out of the room and just left. Well, I jumped out of bed, ran out of the door and took a left, and I was shocked to see him again walking across my living room. I ran up behind him to swing at this guy, and he just disappeared when I got near him. After this, I didn't know whether I was going crazy or what, but I called paranormal investigators to set a date for mid-February. I had a cruise to go with my friend in January, and Jane was not happy about it, especially with our relationship where it was at. She didn't stay there when I was away, though, and the morning before the trip, I was up early packing in the spare room. Jane was asleep in bed, and all of a sudden it sounded like an avalanche was happening from our bedroom. Jane screamed my name loudly, and as I ran across the living room to get to the bedroom, I noticed what seemed just like a wave energy, I suppose. It's hard to describe, but it started at our bedroom where the commotion was and was moving away from it. It literally knocked the wind out of me, and I saw or heard something knocking into everything into the room as it moved. She was petrified and in tears. A lamp was broken, and I don't know why, but this was the incident that scared me the most. I think it's because I was so awake and alert, and it was at night as well, and somebody else was there to witness it. So it had all the confirmation that I needed to know that I don't think I was going crazy. But then came the cruise. So this was almost a normal week, and one night I woke up to my friend that I was bunking with standing next to my bed. Initially I freaked out, and when I did, he woke up from his actual bed. So in other words, he was not the one actually standing there. My friend says that when he first woke up, he saw a black shadow figure standing next to my bed. Obviously, I saw him and not a shadow figure, so We were seeing two different things, but we both saw this thing just disappear into nothing. Oddly enough, too, this was the last thing that ever happened to me. It's been over a year since then, and I got back, and after a month of no activity, I ended up just cancelling the investigators. One last note, though, that makes this really interesting as well. After this was all over, I visited this girl that I know who was sensitive to these things. Her name was Sarah, and remember how the night that started it all, when Jane's family was visiting, well, I didn't even mention that detail to Sarah. But earlier that first night, I went to Jane's mum and stepdad's house for the first time ever to meet them and have dinner and whatnot. It wasn't a fairy tale meet by any means, but the night started pretty good. Her stepdad got really drunk and eventually got mean towards Jane as well. Him and I ended up fighting, and the mum and the brother came and stayed with us. And Sarah had asked me if my girlfriend's father was an addict after I told her about the haunting. This was a really out-of-the-blue question, but I said yes, that he's an alcoholic and a drug addict. And Sarah said that this must have all come from him when we crossed paths. His energy had allegedly stuck with me, and he's a nasty, abusive addict, so it all kind of just made sense to me in the end. Anyways, Jane and I didn't work out in the end, and we're on good terms and talk occasionally. I can truly say that these were the darkest times mentally of my life for sure, and I definitely have a different perspective on the universe than I did before it all happened. I'm just really glad, though, that it's all over now. So, it all started when I was in middle school. I would get home and enjoy my time by myself while my mum was gone to get my younger brothers. And it started with little things, just here and there. I would take my shoes off by the door, and maybe a little later I would walk by them to grab something from the kitchen, but that's when I noticed that they would go from being side by side to being in a sort of T position. I would always shrug it off and assume that I must have done that carelessly and didn't remember. Then I started hearing people talking coming from other rooms. After a week of that, I started hearing knocking noises and things would get pushed off my desk. And honestly, I could go on and on about all the little things that happened. But what really struck me was the night that I was laying in bed facing the wall. I felt what I can only describe as a cold hand grab my shoulder, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. I thought for sure that it was my mum, to be honest. I even turned and looked, but saw no one. I was immediately panicked, and I ran to my mum's room, and that was the first time that it really frightened me. And after that happened, I didn't see it or feel it for quite some time. Fast forward a few years later to the beginning of high school, I invited a friend over to hang out, and he planned on staying the night. He ended up going home because he claimed to see the face of an old man staring at him in the mirror hung in my bedroom. After that, all the little things that were happening a few years prior, they slowly started happening again. It was manageable, though. I could still sleep through the night without being bothered at the time. It kept doing little things, moving shoes, making little knocking noises, and just general things that would make you sit there and say to yourself, oh no, that was probably just something that I did. But eventually, it seemed to leave again. A few years after that, though, I graduated and started going through the EMT and fire academy. I remember the first night it started pretty vividly, and I was laying in bed and my cat was at the foot of the bed. The hallway has a door to it and a bathroom right next to my bedroom. I was playing on my phone or something, and all of a sudden heard the loudest bang come from the bathroom. It sounded like someone kicked the heck out of the bathroom door. You could hear the initial hit and the door bouncing off the wall as well. I practically jumped out of my skin and, for a split second, thought that it was my cat, but quickly realized that he was still on the end of my bed. That same night, too, I felt someone sit down at the end of my bed and started to rock back and forth. And after that first night, it would do that every single night for the rest of my time at my mum's house. It would always sit down, stand up, and then pace around my bedroom, almost as if whatever this was anxious. And after a solid month of dealing with it nightly, I started to think that I must be losing my mind. So I told a couple of friends of mine. One of them, too, has a mum that's very into tarot card readings and was good at it. At the time, I didn't believe in any of that. I was already having a hard time wrapping my mind around the fact that I was being haunted by a ghost. And anyway, even though I didn't believe in the readings, she ended up nailing a lot of the info about my grandpa that passed away when I was really young. She even described what he looked like and guessed his name perfectly. And even with me being as skeptical as I was, I quickly started to believe that she was onto something. She and another person that I met too that did readings as well both said that my grandpa wasn't the one haunting me, but instead was there protecting me from whatever this other thing was that had been bugging me. They also said that this thing has something to tell me. To this day, I still don't know what it is, and that there are multiple spirits that go through that house. Taking all that info in was just crazy to me. Believable given all the things that I'd seen, but still felt crazy. Especially since I just wanted to get answers on how to get rid of it at the time because I wasn't getting any sleep at night. Well, after taking in all that info and learning how to get rid of it, I finally felt a sense of relief. I still had a lot of questions and still do, but I was relieved. I eventually moved out of my mum's and I live in my own now. Unfortunately, it never fixed my ghost problem. It seems to follow me anywhere that I go, though lately it hasn't been bad at all. I think I've just gotten used to it at this point and am no longer as scared as I used to be when unexplainable things happen. It really makes me wonder a lot of things though. Like when the spirit came and left for periods of time, where did it go? What was it that he had to say so bad? I'll probably never know, but thanks for listening. After listening to everybody's stories here, it reminded me of a brief time in life where I lived in a haunted location, and one specific event that spooked me real good. I specify location because my entire life, someone or something has been trying to do me harm, and I've had to take precautions to keep it at bay. This haunting was unrelated to that incident, or at least that's my belief. So, after arriving at my first duty station, I quickly worked to get out of the 1960s dorms and into a place of my own. I had a guy that I got along with well enough mention he and his wife were looking for a roommate, so I went through the whole process of vetting and such, and we moved in. But for various reasons, this arrangement lasted maybe 7 months. After a bit of time with no issues, I began to get that stereotypical you're being watched feeling, especially while alone. Having 2 dogs and a cat that never seemed to freak out about it put me at ease, I suppose, but a bit of time goes on and little things started happening. Things will fall or move or go missing for no reason. Just typical stuff. But one night we had a glass plate just randomly somehow fall out of a cupboard and smash on the floor below. Checking the cupboard and the plate supply, that's what happened, and there was no plausible explanation in sight. We began to jokingly refer to it as the ghost of the upstairs neighbor, as for months we would hear the upstairs neighbors making noises all hours, and then one day it stopped. Likely just moved out, I suppose. A friend and I began to share past experiences with unknown forces. He had had some experience with a Native American ghost out west where he came from. As for me, well, that's a whole other story. But the big event in question was on a night where he and his wife went out for a date night, leaving me with the 2 dogs and the cat. Now, until about 8 p.m, things were honestly fine. I was playing some game on the couch with the animals in their usual spots, but then I started getting the usual feeling of being watched and tried to ignore it. All of a sudden, though, there was this, I don't know how to explain it, but just tension in the air. It was hot and heavy, hard to breathe. And for the first and only time that I'd ever seen, even the animals freaked out. Meow ran towards the married couple's bedroom. Odin and Zeki completely stood up and were growling, snarling, and being aggressive towards a spot close to the TV. I couldn't see or feel any presence per se, but all my internal alarms were going off for some reason. It's at this point that I very carefully and slowly turned off the PlayStation and TV, preparing to make an exit, that the crucifix above the fireplace flies off of it. Not far by any means, maybe 2 feet where it landed from the fireplace, but when it happened, the dogs jumped back and one of them barked. I grabbed the little one in my arms and grabbed the big one's collar and started running to my room. We get in there and they both get on the bed as I'm slamming the door shut and turning the lights on. I quickly moved to also shut the bathroom door as the bathroom was connected to my room and the main living area. The big one spent the remainder of the night with his eyes locked on the door, and the little one occasionally growled but stayed attached to my hip. I called my roommates home and told them everything. They didn't appear as spooked as I was. I did think about trying to get Meow, but frankly, he liked to bite me anyway, so I wasn't risking going out there for him. I think I went around the house the next time I was alone and tried to send this thing out, but I didn't feel very confident. At the time, I wasn't all that good of a Christian. The friend was technically a Catholic, though, despite his experiences with the paranormal, was leaning towards agnosticism. His wife followed a specific form of Buddhism, I think. But in any case, the house just felt off in terms of spiritual energy. But then again, maybe I was just paranoid after the event. I'm not sure. Smaller occurrences still occurred. There was more than a few nights I kept the lights on at night, and the one other notable event was towards the end of my time there, and the couple had a child who was crying every night, and I wasn't about to have that, so in the end I just opted to move out. A short while before my departure, we were standing in the living room talking nonsense really, when the door to my room violently shut by itself. He was drunk and we were already a little bit excitable, rather than scared at the time, and this made us really sort of slap happy, laughing hysterically about the ghost of our neighbour and all that stuff. But anyway, one day I might go into detail about the things that followed me all my life, but for now, this is my story, and I hope you enjoyed it. So I want to share something which happened nearly a year ago, just after the birth of my twin daughters. It's probably best to explain where we were, so me and my fiancée, we were staying in UHNM, Stoke Hospital Maternity Ward 206, gratefully before COVID really took a grasp on England, and I was thankfully allowed to stay with my family in hospital for the length of time that we were there. So because my daughters were premature, together with the fact that they were delivered by an emergency C-section, my girls and my partner had to stay in for a few days to ensure that they were putting on weight, etc., and ensuring that my partner was recovering well. Now, before their birth, my partner was admitted to hospital a couple of times before and was placed in a room of her own. I wasn't allowed to stay at this point, and while she was unpacking her bag, a little girl stood in her doorway. My partner saw her and said hi, with the little girl smiling and then running off. This seemed pretty normal until she realized that it was quite late, about 10 p.m. as she was admitted late in the day. However, she gave it the benefit of the doubt and didn't think too much of it. Fast forward to about 3 days after my girls were born and we were just getting ready for bed, again around 8 p.m.-ish. My partner suddenly is pretty much bedbound at this point due to a pretty bad infection, says hi again. As I turn around, I see a little girl smile at our girls, then turn and run off again. Me and my partner both came to the decision that the girl must be staying with one of the other mothers in another room. I had my doubts in honesty, as I had been there 3 days and hadn't seen her once, but ignored it as a lot had happened and I probably didn't pay much attention. A couple of days later, we had to move rooms within the same ward, but in the midwife section, as my girls were discharged, but my partner had to remain in due to the infection. Oddly, it was the same room my partner had to stay in when she was admitted before she gave birth. And that same night we went into that room was very, very strange, as a few different things happened. First, my partner saw the little girl again. I didn't see her, but she told me that something just wasn't right, as the little girl was staring blankly at the window. Also, what was strange was that I didn't come across the girl at all as I came back from the kitchen area. Second, the privacy curtain that we had drawn kept moving like there was a strong draft, but only every now and again, not constant. Now, there was no window open, our room door was closed, and if you ever have visited that particular ward before, you know that there's no draft coming out from the corridor, like at all. Now, the most unexplainable thing which happened, though, that led me to posting this experience, started off when I went into the ensuite area to have a shower and brush my teeth before going to sleep. My partner had taken some medication which had put her to sleep. Please bear in mind, too, that because of the C-section, she had to lie flat on her back, and also due to the infection, she could barely move properly, and was not moving freely, to say the least. My partner does sleep talk, and whilst I was brushing my teeth, I heard her murmur, "Yes, nurse, if you're sure." Now, no nurse had come into that room at all, and even if they had managed to have snuck in, they would have walked past the bathroom door, which was open, so I could listen out for my girls, and I would have heard them speak, even if quietly anyway. So I ignored her and put it down to her sleep talking. I walked out of the bathroom, and the privacy curtain, which was closed, was now wide open. The room was bitterly cold, and my partner was now lying on her side, completely tucked in. First, hospital beds are not quiet. You hear every movement, and for my partner to be able to flip over onto her side would have made a lot of noise, together with the fact that she would have been groaning in pain just to move. But that's ignoring the fact that she was tucked in as well. I immediately went over to her, woke her up and asked her how she managed to get into that position, and she replied, "The nurse did it," which I obviously stated that there was no nurse. She opened her eyes and snapped at me, "The one with the hat." At that point, she fully woke up, and I think she realized what she said. It dawned on her exactly what she had seen and interacted with wasn't what a nurse of 2020 would be wearing. We were both pretty shook up, as it was completely surreal. We were there for a couple of nights longer, and I personally didn't experience anything else. However, my partner saw that little girl every night in the doorway for the whole time that we were there. I guess the biggest question is, has anyone else been to this ward or even the hospital and experienced anything similar at all? It's just always really stuck with me and made an already unforgettable experience all the more interesting. I've got no idea who that little girl could have been if it wasn't a girl staying with her mother, and she would have to have been there for at least 2 months if she was. I'd love to hear some of your opinions though, and if anything similar has happened to anyone else. In any case, thanks for listening. This older man has lived in a corner basement unit in my girlfriend's apartment unit for many years now. I noticed too, when we walked down the basement hall to go do laundry, that I could always hear loud music coming from his apartment. It was loud, but not loud enough that you'd hear it in your own unit or anything. He also always had sheets over his windows, even on the nicest, sunniest days. We would always make jokes that he plays loud music 24/7 because he probably has a hostage in there. Fast forward up until last week, we get back from getting groceries and notice cop cars outside the apartment, a dead body being brought out, and him outside. A good friend lives in the unit across from him and could hear everything going on, what the cops were saying, so she filled us in on all the info that she could get. And it turns out that he had called about his girlfriend dying of COVID. They came to get the body and asked questions, and he supposedly moved the body from the bedroom to the living room and kept changing the time that she had died. He said this morning and also last night, but the cops said that it looked like the body had been there for at least a few days. We speculate that he called when it started to smell and used COVID as an excuse so that they would stay out of the apartment as much as they could. He also apparently lied about her name multiple times, and they couldn't find any ID on her. She was so severely malnourished as well, and had bed sores in her body so bad that the cops said that she probably couldn't have even walked. The cop who was on the scene saw a lot of unmarked pill bottles and decided to look around when he found a 13-year-old girl hiding in the bedroom who was completely mute, malnourished, and was missing chunks of her own hair. He never mentioned the little girl either, even went as far to tell them that no one else was in the house. But let me make it known, too, that this is a small one-bedroom apartment. He never even told the landlord that he had 2 people living with him. In fact, my girlfriend also has never even seen or heard these people. The cop also said that there was no type of ID or birth certificate for the little girl, and the apartment was completely riddled with black mold and no edible food anywhere. They also found several guns. This man turned out to be in his early 60s, and the woman who died was 30. It also turns out that he never got arrested for who knows why. I'm sure that they're building a case against him. The girl got taken away. We called the landlord the next day to see if she knew what was going on, and she said that she was evicting him and he would be gone in a few weeks. Over this period, the music has stopped, and we've seen him taking out some sort of a large cage to the dumpster. He also told the landlord that the woman died of natural causes and COVID wasn't involved in the end. We talked to a woman who lived in the unit above him, and she said that she actually called the police multiple times on him because for several months she kept hearing a muffled someone screaming help, which means that the cops clearly had done nothing. But he must have known that she had said something because after she had called, he had left literal crap in front of her apartment door, and also would scream at her and call her all sorts of nasty words if he ever saw her. It is all speculation as to what actually happened in that apartment, but it is very clear that there's some foul play there for sure. We have even guessed that he didn't actually live there full time and would just hold them there and come there whenever he wanted to get off and abuse them in some way or something. I've seen the man once in passing, but I've never really spoken to him. We don't really know what's going on, but I'll keep you guys posted if there's any updates. So if any of you haven't heard one of the other stories that I shared here this week, I'll give you guys some background. So, I am and have been a paramedic for about 10 years. My entire career has been spent in emergency medicine, responding to 911 calls and providing advanced life support for life-threatening illnesses and injuries. The calls that we respond to range from inappropriate use of an ambulance to minutes away from death, and oftentimes it's already too late. If you've heard my other story here, then you know the background, but in 2014 I moved to another city a couple of hours away from home to work. The city was smallish, less than 100,000 people, but the ambulance serviced the entire county where the city resides. At the time, too, there was a significant oil boom in the area, so thousands of people flooded the city and the county to work in the oil fields nearby. This caused the city to get a little rougher as you had people from just all over the country moving there to work, and that many people in a small place increased the cost of living, and we saw a large increase in violent crimes, as well as traumatic injuries too. We worked 24-hour shifts, which weren't too bad. The days were usually somewhat busy, and at night the ambulance station had rooms with twin beds that allowed you to get some fairly decent sleep at night. Most of the calls that would classify as crazy or creepy or scary always tend to come at night, though. So, the day that this story takes place was a little bit different than normal. Normally, I get an EMT basic partner, which means that since I'm the advanced provider on the truck, I get all of the patients. But today, I had another paramedic partner because we were actually training in a new hire paramedic. It was her first day in FTO, field training orientation, and this means that we generally let her take the calls and sit back and evaluate her performance to ensure that she's capable and doesn't kill anyone. This was her first job after graduation, so she was still pretty green. I could see that she was very nervous as well and trying really hard to do her best. So, as per usual, the day was pretty busy, but as it began to wind down, I was getting ready to attempt to take a nap. I kick off my boots and I lay down on the bed, on the top of the covers. Easier to get up and going that way if a call comes in. I put my radio up on my bed, full volume like I always do, so I can be sure to wake up if we get a call. And, sure enough, midnight starts to roll around, and I hear a call to go out. Dispatch says man who has been stabbed is not breathing. Luckily, it's not my call, and another ambulance responds, so I go back to bed, or at least try to. Because about 30 minutes later, another call goes out, and this time, it's definitely for me. The dispatch information is man with a knife wound in his hand. Police are on the scene. I get my boots on, wake up the girl and my partner, and walk out to the ambulance. The area of the call was right smack dab in the middle of downtown. We responded non-emergent as it was not a life-threatening injury. And as we arrive on the scene, there's probably around 6 police cars on scene, all with their lights on. The area itself was through an alleyway and behind a building just off the main street. As we pull up, there are a number of officers, a couple of sheriff deputies and a detective, all standing around this man with a rag on his hand. As I got closer, I could see the man was bald, middle-aged, and had almost a homeless look to him. He also had a big dark spot in the middle of his forehead, but one of the officers approached me to fill me in on what was going on before I talked to the guy and start to treat him. The officer tells me that the man has a large laceration on the back of his hand that he received from a knife. At this point, I was still a bit groggy and didn't put 2 and 2 together, but the officer says that the man said that he was attacked by another man and that he's probably going to need stitches. So, as it's not too serious, I have my FTO approach first to begin her assessment and give me her treatment plan. I stay close behind her and we both walk up to the man who was in handcuffs. As we approach, the dark spot on the guy's forehead is now clear, on the center of his forehead, stretching from his eyebrows and what would have been his hairline, is the biggest swastika tattoo that I have ever seen. My FTO begins to talk to the man as I stand back and observe. Something about that man's general composure, too, and responses just really chilled me. When we first walked up, the man was muttering something underneath his breath. I couldn't tell what he was saying, but he was repeating it over and over. My FTO asked police to uncuff him to see the cut on his hand more clearly. At this point, one of the other officers produced the knife that he believes to be the weapon that caused the injury. The knife was in an evidence baggie, and it was just covered in blood. It was nothing special, though. It just looked like a cheap plastic pocket knife or something, like you would buy at some cheesy gift shop. It was a folding knife, though, with a black plastic handle and a blade that was maybe 3 inches long, with a bit of a serration towards the handle, perhaps. The man showed us his hand, and on the back, cutting right through another large swastika tattoo, was a laceration that went from the base of his pinky finger to the lower fleshy part of his thumb. It was quite wide also, maybe 3 centimeters, exposing the bones of the metacarpals as well as tendons. The bleeding had mostly stopped with pressure from the towel that he was holding onto. And when my partner asked the man what had happened, the man then repeated to us what he'd been repeatedly muttering to himself. "I killed him, man. He's dead, man. I had to kill him. He's got to be dead." At this point, I'm starting to put it together as well and understanding the larger picture here. We get the man into the ambulance, though, so we can assess for any other injuries that may not be visible under his clothing. After a thorough search, we realize that there are no other injuries, so we begin to transport him to the hospital. My FTO bandaged the man's hand, and as we're driving, I start to ask questions to try and figure out the details. The man told me everything that I wanted to know, and never lost that chilling vibe, mind you, staring distantly as he recounted what happened. The man told me that he's homeless and was wandering around when a friend offered him a ride. He says that he was leery of the man. I think he meant wary, but decided to get in anyway and accept the offer. The man said the friend began asking him if he hated black people. The man said that he didn't, obviously, and that he wasn't racist. And he tells me that this is when his friend became upset with him and tried to stab him with a pocket knife. The man said that he attempted to defend himself, managed to wrestle the knife away from his friend, and stabbed him back before jumping out of the car and running. So, with this shocking telling of the tale, we continued to transport the man in silence. Also, as a side note as well, an officer rode in the ambulance with us the whole way, which, with what happened at the end of this story, I'm actually very thankful for. So after we dropped the man off at the ER, we all just kind of sat there, sort of shocked, leaving the hospital. We returned to the station and tried to get some sleep, but we were just not destined for sleep that night, and an hour later we get another call for a body removal from downtown, less than 3 blocks away from our last call. We pull up to the area, which is in the middle of the street. The street itself is blocked off 100 feet on both sides by a fire truck and police cars. The fire truck was equipped with a double stack of 4 halogen lights, risen up the ladder shining down to illuminate the area. Walking up with the stretcher and the body bag, the detective on scene tells us that they're done with the investigation and that they're ready for us to take the body to the medical examiner's office. At this point, we're still about 50 feet away from where the body lay. From where we are, I can see the person lying in the middle of the street, though. We get closer and take a few minutes to examine the body, and what I see and putting together what I was told is just astonishing to say the least. So the man, another middle-aged man mind you, appears white or possibly Mexican, lays in the middle of the street on his back with his arms spread eagle and his legs straight. There's a vehicle parked on the side of the road with its driver door still open. I figured that this must be the guy's vehicle, but it was parked neatly, not haphazardly or incorrectly. The deceased man has streaks of blood coming from his nose and mouth, with several small puncture wounds on his face and cheeks. And looking at his torso, there are about a dozen more knife-shaped puncture wounds in the chest and the abdomen, and most of the wounds were so jagged and barbaric looking that you could see like fatty tissue pushing out of them. There wasn't much of a blood puddle under the man, but a very large trail of blood ran from the man to the side of the street where the curb was. The blood then continued its flow another 10 feet along the curb before spilling into a storm drain. And with that much blood, the man was exsanguinated and let out there in the middle of the street. We packed the man into the body bag and we transported him back to the ME's office. When we got back to the station, my charge medic told me that the officer that rode with the first patient requested that we fill out a report on what we heard the man say. Thankfully, the rest of the shift was pretty uneventful. But fast forward to a couple of years ago, I received a call from the state's attorney. He told me that this person is going to trial for murder, is pleading not guilty, and he would like to go over my statement with me as I would be a key witness and require my testimony in court. We went over my statement and we talked about it a bit. Then he told me that he would be in touch and wished me a good day. A few days later, he calls me up again and informs me that the man changed his plea to self-defense and that I was needed in court in a week. And literally, one day before the trial, he calls me up again and he tells me that this time the man changed his plea to guilty and I was no longer needed. I don't really know what happened after that, if I'm being honest. I never really looked into it because, well, it's just another brick in the wall, so to speak. A story filed away in my brain and probably never to be forgotten. This story begins with my boyfriend. He had his foot operated on a few days prior to this, so he was still walking on crutches. We wanted to go to the city centre to hang out with some friends and get some drinks and whatnot, but since cycling wasn't an option because of the crutches, we live in the Netherlands, so basically we use our bicycles for everything. We decided to walk. We actually don't live that far out of the centre, about a 15-minute walk I would say, so it seemed like the most logical choice at that time. We left the centre around 2 in the morning. The way to our house is heavily populated and there are always people on the streets. This night, however, it was oddly quiet. We were about 5 minutes on the way when I spotted a guy on the opposite side of the street. He was looking at the shop windows, but also sort of keeping an eye on us. I suddenly felt very vulnerable, if that's the right word. Considering my boyfriend was walking on crutches and me being quite small, I'm like 5 feet. The guy walked in the opposite direction, but then walked back again, doing this a few times. I tried to walk faster, but my boyfriend couldn't keep up, so we had to keep quite a slow pace. When all of a sudden, the guy crossed the road really quickly in a straight line towards us. I'm small but fierce, so I was ready to fight, when suddenly, around a corner, a homeless man just came walking towards us and the man. He was shouting and cursing to no one in particular. Apparently the homeless man had frightened the creepy guy so much that he immediately just ran away. We walked away as quickly as we could, and we kept looking back to see if this creepy guy had followed us, obviously, but we thankfully didn't see him again. I fully believe that the creepy guy had bad intentions. Maybe robbing us, maybe even worse. I'm not too sure, but I also believe that that homeless man, he saved us, intentional or not, and for that, I'll forever be grateful. So when I was in high school, it was my senior year. I was 5'3", about 95 pounds, and I was at the park down the street from my house waiting for the school bus. Usually my boyfriend, who was already graduated, would drive me to school, but he was busy. I later found out that he was cheating on me, actually. Well, there was usually a few of us girls there waiting, but this day I was the only one there. So I sat down on the bench, and I had one headphone in and one out so that I could listen to my surroundings. I've always been cautious of what's going on around me, and as I waited, a black Honda pulled up, and I immediately noticed it. I kept an eye on it because I just had a bad feeling about it. I wasn't making it obvious by any means that I was watching it because I didn't want to look crazy, but after a few minutes, 2 big men got out. I immediately texted my boyfriend that I was at the park and these guys were creeping me out. Of course, he didn't text back, so I copy-pasted the same text on my cousin who was home. I lived with my aunt and my 2 guy cousins, who was unwinding down from his night shift. I wanted someone to know the car make and color, plus that it was 2 men. But I didn't get any responses. When they got out of their car, they started to walk towards me, so I got up from the bench and walked towards the street because the bus was supposed to be there any minute anyway. The driver actually ended up being a little bit late as well, and as I stood by the street, these men walked up to me and I could just feel the bad energy. But one guy said hello as the other stood there staring me down. I just sort of did a small half smile and a nod and then looked away. And then the same guy, who I'll call number 1, asked how old I was. I didn't respond. I could tell the other guy, number 2, was getting mad that I wasn't feeding into it. Then number 1 kept asking me yes or no questions like, do you have a boyfriend? Do you live close by? Do you do drugs? We have some. Do you want some? And then 2 asked me if I knew what the black market was. I felt a cold rush go over my body and I got the chills instantly. 2 was quiet the whole time and started to tell me that they just got back from Russia, but the way he said it was just really creepy. Almost intimidating, in fact. I knew that they were from somewhere else because they had strong accents, but I just couldn't pin the place. They kept telling me to get into their car because they have drugs. I just said no thank you. Trust me, I wasn't a straight edge in high school, but I was not stupid either. I would never get into somebody's car that I didn't know. Then number 1 asked if I have a car. I said no, and that my bus is almost here. Sorry, I have to go. And by some sort of miracle, the bus rounded the corner and the guys backed off. They had been inching closer and closer as they asked me questions, but before the bus got to me, number 1 handed me a card and said that he has a car shop and to call him sometime if I need anything. He even stated that he'd give me a free car if I wanted. The card looked shifty, and I didn't want to grab it, but I knew that I needed that number on it to report it. So I took it, and they walked off super fast. Finally, the bus stopped and picked me up, and as soon as I got on, I started to cry, and I just had a complete meltdown. It was like all of the adrenaline was keeping my mind and my body aware and focused while the men were there, but as soon as I was safe, my body and mind just gave out. Thankfully, there weren't that many people on the bus, so the driver calmed me down before we took off, and I explained to her what had happened. When she looked around for the car, they were gone. She said that she saw them around me, but thought that I knew them because, well, they were so close to my person. The driver called into a dispatch saying that there was an incident so that they could notify the school. She continued to pick all the other students up, but when we got to the school, she walked me into the office and I was absolutely terrified to be alone. The principal came out and so did the campus security. They were really sweet and gentle with me as they brought me back to the principal's office. Both were men and they proceeded to ask me questions about the men, their car, and even the questions the creeps asked me. I cried the whole time, and then I pulled out the card the guy gave me and handed it to the principal. He looked at the security and said that he was going to call it and act like my dad, so he did. It was on speaker, and number 1 answered. I knew his voice as if it was burned into my brain at that point. It took everything in me not to have a panic attack as well. But the principal asked the guy if he could get him a car at a good price, and the guy played dumb. The principal said that his daughter, me, gave him the card, and as soon as he said that, the guy just hung up. They tried calling again, and the phone was shut off, and then eventually disconnected. I could see a shift in the principal and even the security as soon as the phone clicked. The security got on his phone and called the police and had them come to the school. It was as if they finally knew that it was real, like my crazy story wasn't just made up. The principal eventually excused himself and the security guard as well, and they talked for a minute in the hall. I could hear everything that they were saying. She's lucky to be alive. This is serious. We need to call her parents to come and get her. When the police got there, they came into the office that I was sitting in and asked me for the story again, and in front of the principal and the security guard. I feel like they wanted to see if I was being 100% honest, so I obliged. The officers were straight up with me and told me that it sounded like they were watching us girls at that park because they chose the one day that one of us was alone there. He also said that the card was being used as bait to get me to go where they wanted. I felt sick and I just couldn't breathe. The school called my aunt, but she didn't pick up. The only person that actually picked up first was my boyfriend, believe it or not. One of the officers talked to him as the other finally got a hold of my aunt, though. My boyfriend ended up picking me up and taking me home, and I just cried the whole time. When I got there, my grandma, uncle, and aunt, my mum and my cousins were all out front. The women were all in tears, and the men were absolutely livid, but also worried for me. And a week later, some girl at another high school, not far from the park, was saved by other students. She was apparently being dragged into a black Honda by 2 guys. The other kids stood up and grabbed her and pulled her out of their car. The principal called me into his office, and that's actually how I found out. They also had the same officers there, and they even had me choose the 2 guys out of a picture lineup. I pointed them out quickly, and they were caught. And yes, it was in fact those same 2 guys that tried grabbing that second girl too, a freshman girl. Quite honestly too, I felt worried for her and sad that she went through worse than I did. But I must admit that I almost felt free again. Still scared, but not looking over my shoulder so often, because I couldn't believe that they were caught. After that, my family teamed up to drive me to school for the rest of the year. My boyfriend, and now ex, also took me some days. And I guess that I'm just thankful to be alive and well. And I am even more thankful that the girl was also saved by the courageous kids at her high school. So, I've timelined and tried to write everything down that I remember about these experiences to give me a bit of a guide when writing this. But it all started from when I was very young, and the first instance of this happening was when I was living with my grandmother. Her and I were very close. This will play in later. I was wide awake in bed, unable to sleep with her to my right. There's no doubt in my mind that she was deeply asleep, only a few inches from me. Every television in the house was off, and the only other person in the house was my grandfather asleep in his room. Then, very clearly and also really loudly, I hear my grandma call from the kitchen. It was almost as if she was calling me for dinner, it was that loud. I know it's common to hear your name being called mistakenly, but I did more research on this as a teen, and apparently when you hear your name being called this loud, you're supposed to reject it. I didn't at the time. Not knowing this, I just huddled closer to my grandmother and kept my eyes locked on the open door. The second instance was probably around when I was 13 or 14, when my father took me on a family trip to Las Vegas. We visited some part of the Grand Canyon, and while my family was waiting in line for a skywalk bridge that we had paid a tour for, I wandered around the edge a good distance away from my family and decided to yell my name into the canyon to hear my echo. When it came back to me, it sounded sort of distorted and almost like grandmother had yelled my name back. It may not have been my grandmother exactly, but it was eerily similar for some reason. Nevertheless, just the fact that it was distorted was enough to scare me a little. I don't really put much weight into this particular experience because it might have just been my voice being thrown weird, but I just thought that I should mention it. But this next one happened when I was 13 or 14 as well. It's the most terrifying one that I've had, and every time that I tell this story to people, I start to cry or even tear up a bit. This is the closest that I've ever been to whatever this is, and proves my point that it's mimicking people that I care about. So I was on vacation with my family in Key West and had rented a home. I invited my best friend, who we'll call Ash, to stay with us. On the third day, we had decided to skip out on the boating trip and mooch off of the house's owner's Netflix all day. On about the fifth episode of what we were watching, we decided on a snack refill and a bathroom break. So we paused the television and I make my way to the kitchen. I believed that Ash had followed me into the kitchen, I think, and leaned on the island while I prepared some chips with my back turned to her. I held a full conversation with her and even looked back at her on her phone. I fully had no doubt in my mind that I was talking and looking at Ash on her phone. She was even holding it in the specific way that Ash does. I turned my back for a split second to pick up the bowls and suggest that we head back to the couch when I see Ash, or the real Ash anyway, walk out of the bathroom, which was a solid 30 feet away. My body immediately went cold, and the first thing that I asked her was how she got to the bathroom and in and out without me hearing it like that. She then gave me the weirdest look and told me that she'd been in there the whole time since we got up. This is where I start freaking out and insisting that I had just been talking with her and even physically saw her. She joked about doppelgangers and how maybe she was going to die. I quickly suggested that we get out of the house and walk around the neighborhood. She then informed me that she had gotten her period while she was in the bathroom the same time that I was talking to whatever I was talking to. And then we walked around until my mum called me that she was back in the house. We're still best friends to this day and have been for 11 years now. I asked her about it today before I wrote this as well, and she said that she didn't hear me talking with anybody at all the whole time that I was apparently out there. Now, at this point, you guys must think that I'm crazy, I know, but for this next one, I actually have a witness. Honestly, too, I felt like I was a little crazy after it happened with people who freaked out as much as me. But again, I was on vacation near the Great Smoky Mountains, just a little west in Tennessee, though. We had our previous reservations cancelled, so we took this little rundown cabin owned by a local woman. We got there late at night, and the moment we all stepped out of the car, the first thing that we heard was a man's voice saying, "Hey neighbours," coming from a cabin to the left of ours that was higher up on the mountain that we were on. We couldn't see the cabin really, just a road that led further up, so we assumed that he could see us, but we just couldn't see him. Probably some guy on his balcony, right? Well, my friendly stepdad yelled "hey," and he waved up towards the direction that it came from. It wouldn't have been that weird if this didn't happen every time that we stepped out of the cabin or the car, and my family completely wrote it off as some type of hospitality that we're not used to in Miami. Retelling it though, my brother and my friends agreed that it was a bit weird. I did hear constant footsteps around the cabin at night, and some outside my window too. It was a raised cabin, so probably a story or two off the ground. But I don't give it much thought, since wildlife is a thing in the woods, and it's just something that I thought that I should mention. But the thing that really propelled me into researching what the heck was happening to me was when I was having a photo shoot in the woods behind the cabin, and both my brother, sister, and I too heard something calling my name deeper into the woods. Since I was with my younger siblings, I went into full big sister protection mode, and almost threw them back into the little slope that we had to climb to get into the woods in the first place. We were all just crapping ourselves from how clear it was and how we all pinpointed it was coming from deeper in the woods and nowhere near the cabin. This was during the day too, and we were all so thrown by this that we just stayed in for the rest of our trip. We all agreed though that it was a woman's voice, and the first thing that I asked my mum when we got inside was, "Did you call me?" She had been lounging in her room with my stepdad all day, trusting that I could take care of the younger ones just outside the cabin. She saw how freaked out the kids were though, and we just didn't really go out at night for the rest of our trip. I think that I reacted so badly to this one mostly because, well, I had kids to take care of, and I could tell that they were terrified out there. Again though, the voice sounded like somebody was looking for me or calling for me back somewhere. With no knowledge of what this could have been though, I had finally decided to look into things when I turned 17. I had no previous knowledge of Wendigos or Skinwalkers or anything cryptid, only ghost investigations and Zach Baggins making something out of a scratchy EVP or something like that. But to be quite honest with you guys, I'm just sort of desperate for answers now because at this point, I'm constantly thinking about it and driving myself into rabbit holes of information and myths and legends, just trying to figure it out. And if you've listened this far, thank you for listening. I know that I'm not the best storyteller and recounting may not be that good, but I was trying to get everything and all the details into a cohesive manner. But please, do let me know if you guys have any thoughts or ideas about what this all could mean. I'm going to start by saying that this was a widely publicized case, so a few details will be changed. But I can assure you that the main part of this is definitely accurate. So a few years ago, I worked at a popular hooker lounge in my town. We had many regulars, so of course I got to know many of the people there, and made some lasting friendships with a few as well. Among those regulars was a group of people that I wasn't terribly fond of, except for one girl, Rachel. Rachel was a kind girl who I would enjoy talking to. I just didn't approve of the people that she hung out with, or the decisions that she made. But it was her life, so what place did I have to say anything? Eventually, Rachel started dating another regular named Ben, who was a part of my friend group. This is when I got a lot closer, and she started trusting me and confiding in me more. Eventually, Rachel and Ben broke up, and it devastated Rachel. I clearly remember her messaging me to hang out and her crying on my shoulder for about half an hour. During their relationship, Rachel stopped hanging around the shady people as much, but of course, afterwards, she went back to them and started partying a lot and doing who knows what. She stopped talking to me as much and eventually started dating some other guy in the shady group named Greg. Of course, that relationship went south, due to reasons unknown to me, but Rachel ended up filing for a restraining order against Greg. In a few days, I think anyway, later, Rachel went missing and was actually never heard from again. It was truly awful as well. Her family started showing up to talk to me, asking if I'd seen her. I hadn't, but apparently someone told them that she was seen downtown somewhere. Honestly, it broke my heart as well. One day, during a busy shift, someone we both talked to sometimes showed up and talked to me about Rachel's disappearance. His name is POS. POS told me that he'd heard about her being seen somewhere and wanted to know what I knew about it. He even asked me if I'd heard if anything had happened to her. I'm assuming that he thought since I worked at a regular hangout spot of hers that I would have heard something. I told him that I hadn't, and we hugged before he walked off to talk to other people. Months passed before I heard anything about Rachel. Her family showed up from time to time asking about her, but nothing changed. But around a year after her disappearance, the police had a breakthrough in her case, and her body was actually found. After some investigating, the police discovered that Greg had actually hired POS to kill Rachel, and he did. He hid her body and continued life as usual. But the fact that I spoke to POS after the fact, and even hugged him, just still weighs on my conscience. It's been years, and I'm still really upset about it. He's in prison, and I'll likely never see him again, but it definitely still hurts. I spoke to her family about her, having hugged the man who killed her. I wish that I had been a better friend to her. Maybe I could have saved her, who knows. Maybe I could have insisted that she didn't hang out with those people. I don't blame myself for her murder or anything, but I do wish that I could have done something. Had I been a more insistent friend, then maybe she would still be here. Who knows? All I do know is that if for whatever reason I ever do see this guy again, it won't be a good thing for him. That's for sure. This happened when I was about 11 years old. I lived in a typical North American suburb. I was out riding my bike and had some money in my pocket. My brother was at home and was actually a little sad that day, so when I heard the distant tune of Do Your Ears Hang Low, which was clearly from an ice cream truck, I sped on my bike to track it down and buy some ice cream to take to my brother. I finally caught up to it as well. The man in the ice cream truck looked different than the old man who we were used to in my neighborhood. He was early 20s, frizzy, Napoleon Dynamite-esque hair, before that movie came out, by the way. And oddly, this van had no markings. It was clean and looked like the same model as any other ice cream truck. Even had the loudspeaker on top, but even to my 11-year-old self, it was odd enough for me to be a little bit hesitant. I asked if he had the SpongeBob ice cream and the gumball eyes, my brother's favorite, and he said that he didn't know all the ice creams that he had in the back, but I could go and check. I hesitate for a moment, and he says, "Look, man, I'm kind of in the middle of the road. I have to move. I'm going to turn up here, and you can climb in the back and pick an ice cream if you want." He pointed left down a street that was being developed. There were only unoccupied in progress houses with dumpsters in front and construction equipment everywhere. I definitely didn't want to go with him down that cul-de-sac where no one could see us. So, in the end, I just ran. I dropped my bike. I still wonder why I didn't just jump back on the bike, but anyway, and I ran maybe a quarter mile home. I immediately told my mum and dad, who were sitting on the porch, what had happened. My mum calls the cops, and my dad gets into his car to find that van. I chill in my room, and I tell my brother my story. My dad actually finally found this guy as well, at a neighbouring pool parking lot where he was trying to lure two preteen girls into his van with the same tactic when a concerned citizen sitting in their car in the parking lot blocked the exit and also signalled a cop. In the end, I guess nothing came of it because when I try to Google my town and keywords that could have pertained to this incident, nothing ever really comes up. I'm not really traumatized at all by it, but sometimes I do wonder how things would have ended up if I could have simply been a dude trying to make some extra money on the side, but who was too lazy to get up and get the ice cream myself. I'm not traumatized by it at all, but sometimes I do wonder how things could have ended up. I mean, it could have simply been a dude trying to make some extra money on the side, but who was too lazy to get up and get the ice cream himself. Sure. It could have been a dude who simply got thrills out of scaring kids, but it could have also been much worse than that. My family still thinks it's funny to hum the tune of Do Your Ears Hang Low when I'm around. I find it humorous, I must admit, but still, it was a bit of a scary moment and something that I don't think I'll ever forget. For background, my family moved to the countryside from the city when I was about 7 years old, and I'm 21 now. Both my parents had grown up in the suburbs, and had also lived in the capital of our state for about 10 years before we moved. It definitely took us some time to get used to the train tracks that ran by our house, the wild animals, the weird but kind neighbours, and the odd visitors as well. Another thing, too, is that you have to get off the main road and turn onto a long gravel drive to get to our house. We can see the entire length of the driveway from certain points in our yard, which is about 3 acres. So, a few years after we moved in, my dad actually got a promotion at work, and as a result, started to go to conferences and business trips that lasted from a few days to a week at times, at least a couple of times a year. My mum felt nervous about being home alone with 2 young kids. I was 10 and my brother was 6, and so we decided to get a dog. We knew that we wanted a big dog, but something that would be gentle with my brother and I. After a few weeks of looking at shelters, we took home Rocky. He was 9 months when we took him home and already pushing 70 pounds. We believe he's a German Shepherd mixed with some sort of northern or mountain breed. We aren't sure to this day, but he's a massive red-coloured dog with a long black muzzle and ears, a fluffy tail that he carries over his back, and a white stripe up his nose. It wasn't long, too, until he was 100 pounds and an absolute force to be reckoned with. Even though he was very gentle with both my brother and I, loved our cats, and was a big ball of joy around anyone that we brought into our house, he tended to be very territorial and aggressive with other dogs, and very protective of us, especially of my mum and I. Once, the electric company came to do some work on the telephone poles on our property, without telling us first, and after 20 minutes they finally had to call us because Rocky had them trapped in their truck, and was jumping up and barking at their windows. I doubt that he would have really attacked them if they had gotten out of their trucks, but it was more than enough to make them think twice. This protective instinct came in very, very handy one particular day. It was summertime, my dad was at work, and my mum was home with my brother and I, since she was a teacher and off for the summer with us. My mum was working in our garden, and my brother and I were just playing close by, with Rocky watching over all of us. Rocky, all of a sudden, sounded the alarm, throwing his head up in the air and barking and howling. He makes a sort of deep woo-woo noise, and I looked up to see a dirty white pickup truck pull off the main road and into our driveway. This wasn't necessarily alarming at first, as people sometimes use our driveway to turn around when they get lost. The white pickup slowly ambled up our driveway, and I could see something strange in the bed. It was lumpy and discolored, but I couldn't really tell what it was until he pulled all the way up into our house, where our other cars were, and honked the horn to get our attention. It was meat. Giant, red chunks of meat with some of the limbs of various animals still attached to it. It was the creepiest thing that I've ever seen in my life. Just a grizzly, scraggly man in his early 50s, driving a pickup truck full of meat in the southern July heat. I immediately just got a really, really bad vibe from this guy, and I remember my mum telling my brother and I to go inside, and we did, but watched out the glass door. Rocky had surprisingly been quiet up to that point, but was now next to my mum, and she had her hand around his collar. The guy rolled down his window and asked my mum if she wanted to purchase some meat, but my mum said no, and to please leave our property. Instead, though, he went on about the different types of meat and asking how much we wanted: beef, venison, pork, etc. My mum asked him to leave again, but instead, he decided to get out of his nasty white pickup. As soon as his feet were on the ground, too, Rocky went absolutely ballistic, barking and snarling and carrying on. This finally made the guy stop. He looked at Rocky, looked at my mum, and asked, "Oh, does your dog bite?" And my mum, deathly serious, replied, "Only if I tell him to." The guy took one more look at Rocky, and I'm guessing decided not to mess with the giant snarling beast. He got back in his truck, backed up, and headed back down our driveway. Now, I don't know if he was really selling the meat or not, but apparently he'd been around to our neighbours, who also had just gotten a really bad vibe from him. We'll never really know what he was really up to with those giant slabs of meat in the back of his pickup truck. Maybe he was just a weird guy trying to sell some sketchy meat. Maybe he was looking for something else. But we never saw Meat Man, as we started to call him, again, though. Rocky is still kicking it, by the way. He's almost 15, actually, and completely deaf, but he's still out in the yard on summer days, always watching over all of us.